Loneliness is one of the most universal of human experiences, and it is also one of the most isolating. The paradox is built into the experience itself. To feel lonely is to feel cut off from others, separated by a distance that no amount of proximity seems to close, and yet the feeling itself is shared by nearly every human being who has ever lived. The person who feels most alone is, in this respect, in the company of all of humanity. Nearly everyone has known the particular ache of loneliness, the sense of being unseen, unheard, disconnected from the others who seem to move through the world in an easy communion that the lonely person watches from the outside. The experience can occur in solitude, in the empty hours of a life without companionship, and it can occur as well in the midst of others, in a crowd or a gathering or even a marriage, when the connection that the human being longs for is somehow absent despite the presence of others. This investigation will examine what contemporary science has revealed about loneliness, what the great philosophical and contemplative traditions have understood about solitude and connection, and what the deeper structure of physical reality might suggest about the relationship between the apparent separateness of individual beings and the underlying connectedness that contemporary physics has been uncovering. The investigation does not claim that loneliness is an illusion, or that the feeling of separateness is somehow mistaken. The feeling of loneliness is real, and the suffering that it causes is real, and no honest engagement with the experience can begin by dismissing it. To tell a person who feels alone that their loneliness is an illusion would be both false and cruel, a dismissal of a genuine experience that deserves to be taken seriously. What the investigation will suggest is that the relationship between the apparent separateness that we feel and the deeper structure of reality is more complex and more interesting than the ordinary understanding assumes, and that the great traditions and the contemporary science have together been uncovering a picture of the relationship between separateness and connection that bears on one of the deepest questions a human being can ask: the question of whether we are, at the deepest level, alone. The contemporary science has not settled this question. The traditions have addressed it across millennia through frameworks that bear striking relationship to what the contemporary science has been revealing. The investigation will examine these frameworks and these findings, with attention always to the genuine complexity of the question and to the honest acknowledgement of what remains uncertain. The scientific understanding of loneliness has advanced substantially across the past several decades, largely through the work of the American social neuroscientist John Cacioppo at the University of Chicago, who is widely regarded as the founder of the field of social neuroscience and who devoted much of his career to the scientific study of loneliness. Cacioppo's work, conducted across the 1990s and the subsequent decades, and summarized in his 2008 book, Loneliness, co-authored with the science writer William Patrick, established that loneliness is not merely a psychological state, but a biological condition, with measurable effects on the body and the brain. The work demonstrated that loneliness is associated with specific patterns of activity in the brain, with measurable effects on the cardiovascular system, the immune system, and the endocrine system, and with significant effects on health and longevity. Cacioppo's research employed a range of methods, including brain imaging studies, which revealed that the brains of lonely individuals respond differently to social stimuli than the brains of individuals who are not lonely. The research demonstrated that lonely individuals show heightened activity in regions of the brain associated with the detection of threat, suggesting that loneliness places the individual in a state of heightened vigilance toward the social environment, a state that the research interpreted as an evolved response to the dangers that isolation represented across the evolutionary history of the species. The research established that chronic loneliness is associated with elevated levels of the stress hormone cortisol, with increased inflammation, with disrupted sleep, and with a range of other physiological effects that contribute to the increased risk of illness and early death that loneliness has been shown to produce. Cacioppo demonstrated that loneliness affects the expression of genes involved in the immune response, with lonely individuals showing patterns of gene expression associated with increased inflammation and decreased antiviral response, a finding developed further through the work of his collaborator, Steve Cole, at the University of California, Los Angeles, on the genomic effects of social isolation. The work established that loneliness is, in evolutionary terms, a signal comparable to hunger or thirst or pain, a signal that alerts the organism to a deficiency that threatens its survival. Just as hunger signals the need for food and thirst signals the need for water, loneliness signals the need for social connection, a need that is, for human beings, as fundamental to survival as the need for food and water. Cacioppo articulated the framework that loneliness, painful as it is, serves an essential evolutionary function, motivating the human being to seek the social connection that is essential to survival and flourishing, in the same way that the pain of hunger motivates the seeking of food. Cacioppo's research also illuminated one of the more painful features of chronic loneliness, the tendency of loneliness to perpetuate itself through the very mechanisms that evolved to alert the human being to the danger of isolation. The research established that chronic loneliness places the individual in a state of heightened vigilance towards social threat, a state that can lead the lonely individual to perceive social interactions as more threatening and less rewarding than they actually are, and thereby to withdraw further from the connections that would alleviate the loneliness. The mechanism that evolved to motivate reconnection can, in the case of chronic loneliness, become a trap that perpetuates the very isolation it evolved to prevent. The recognition of this mechanism bears on the practical question of how the human being may emerge from chronic loneliness, with the research suggesting that the awareness of the heightened vigilance that loneliness produces may itself be a step toward emerging from the trap. The recognition does not diminish the reality of the suffering that loneliness causes, nor does it suggest that the lonely individual is somehow to blame for their loneliness. The recognition rather illuminates the mechanism through which loneliness can perpetuate itself, a mechanism whose understanding may be a step toward the reconnection that the human being most deeply needs. The evolutionary framework that Cacioppo developed bears consideration alongside the frameworks that the contemplative traditions have developed for understanding the human need for connection. The evolutionary framework holds that human beings evolved as profoundly social animals, dependent on the group for survival across the long evolutionary history of the species. The human infant is helpless for longer than the infant of any other species, dependent on caregivers for years before achieving even the most basic independence. The human adult, across most of the evolutionary history of the species, could not survive alone, dependent on the cooperation of the group for protection, for food, for the raising of children, and for the countless other functions that the group performs. The human capacity for language, for cooperation, for the transmission of culture across generations, all of these reflect the fundamentally social nature of the species, a nature that the contemporary evolutionary science has established as central to the understanding of what the human being is. Loneliness, on the evolutionary framework, is the signal that evolved to alert the human being to the threat that isolation represents, a threat that was, across most of human history, a genuine threat to survival. The framework holds that the human being who became isolated from the group faced a genuine danger, and that the painful signal of loneliness evolved to motivate the seeking of reconnection before the danger became fatal. The framework bears striking relationship to the recognition, articulated across the contemplative traditions, that the human being is fundamentally oriented toward connection, that the deepest human longing is for communion with others, and with the deeper reality that the traditions have variously named. The Christian tradition articulated this through the recognition that the human being is made for communion, created in the image of a God who is, on the Trinitarian understanding, himself a communion of persons. The doctrine of the Trinity, central to Christian theology, holds that God is not a solitary monad, but a communion of three persons in one being, and that the human being, created in the image of this God, is therefore created for communion. The framework holds that the human longing for connection reflects the deepest truth about what the human being is, a being created for communion and finding its fulfillment in communion rather than in isolation. The Christian theologian Augustine articulated the framework through his famous recognition in the opening of his Confessions that the human heart is restless until it rests in God, that the deepest human longing is for a communion with the divine reality that no merely human connection can fully satisfy. The convergence between the evolutionary recognition of the human being as fundamentally social and the theological recognition of the human being as made for communion is one of the more striking patterns that the broader engagement with these questions has uncovered, even as the frameworks differ substantially in their specific commitments. The contemporary research has established the profound effects of loneliness on health and longevity through a series of large-scale studies. The work of the American psychologist Julianne Holt-Lunstad at Brigham Young University has been particularly significant, with her 2010 meta-analysis published in the journal PLOS Medicine, establishing that social isolation and loneliness are associated with a substantial increase in the risk of early death, comparable in magnitude to the risk associated with smoking and exceeding the risk associated with obesity and physical inactivity. The meta-analysis examined data from 148 studies involving more than 300,000 participants, establishing that individuals with strong social connections have a 50% higher likelihood of survival across a given period than individuals who are socially isolated. The finding was striking in its magnitude, establishing that the effect of social connection on survival is comparable to the effect of quitting smoking and substantially greater than the effect of many of the health interventions that receive far more public attention. Holt-Lunstad developed the research further through a 2015 meta-analysis, also published in a major journal, which specifically examined the effects of loneliness, social isolation, and living alone, establishing that each of these is associated with a significant increase in the risk of early death. The work established that the effects of social connection on health are not merely psychological, but are reflected in measurable effects on mortality, with social connection being one of the more significant factors affecting human health and longevity. The findings have been developed further through subsequent research, with a contemporary understanding establishing that loneliness and social isolation represent significant public health concerns, comparable in their effects to the major recognized risk factors for illness and early death. The significance of the findings was recognized by public health authorities, with the United States Surgeon General issuing an advisory in 2023 on the public health crisis of loneliness and isolation, describing the effects of social disconnection on health and calling for a societal response to the crisis. The findings bear consideration alongside the recognition, articulated across the contemplative traditions, that the human being flourishes in communion and suffers in isolation, a recognition that the contemporary science has confirmed through the measurable effects of social connection on health and longevity. The recognition that loneliness is a biological signal comparable to hunger or thirst has implications that bear on the question of what loneliness reveals about the nature of the human being. The signal of hunger reveals that the human being requires food for survival. The signal of thirst reveals that the human being requires water for survival. The signal of loneliness reveals that the human being requires connection for survival, that the human being is not a self-sufficient, isolated entity, but a fundamentally relational being whose flourishing depends on connection with others. The recognition bears striking relationship to the frameworks that the contemplative traditions have developed for understanding the relational nature of the human being. The Buddhist tradition articulated the relational nature of all phenomena through the doctrine of dependent origination, the Pratitya Samutpada, which holds that all phenomena arise in dependence on other phenomena and that nothing exists in isolation. The The framework holds that the apparent independence of individual beings is a misperception, that all beings exist in a web of mutual dependence, and that the recognition of this mutual dependence is essential to the understanding of the nature of reality. The doctrine was articulated by the Buddha as one of the central teachings of the tradition, with the framework holding that all phenomena arise in dependence on conditions, and that nothing possesses an independent and isolated existence. The framework was developed further by the Buddhist philosopher Nagarjuna in the 2nd century, whose Madhyamaka analysis articulated the emptiness of all phenomena, the absence of any independent self-existence in anything whatsoever. The framework holds that the very notion of an isolated independent self is a misperception, that the self exists only in dependence on countless conditions and relations, and that the recognition of this dependence is liberating rather than threatening. The Buddhist tradition articulated the framework through the image of Indra's net, developed most fully in the Huayan school of Buddhism, which describes the universe as an infinite net with a jewel at each node, each jewel reflecting all the other jewels in an infinite web of mutual reflection and interdependence. The image articulates the framework that each being contains and reflects all other beings, that nothing exists in isolation, and that the deepest truth about reality is the infinite interconnectedness of all things. The framework bears striking relationship to the contemporary scientific recognition that the human being is fundamentally relational, dependent on connection for survival and flourishing, and it bears striking relationship as well to the deeper interconnectedness that the contemporary physics has been uncovering at the quantum level. The frameworks differ substantially in their specific commitments. The Buddhist framework articulates the relational nature of all phenomena as a metaphysical truth about the structure of reality. The contemporary scientific framework articulates the relational nature of the human being as a biological fact about the evolved nature of the species. The frameworks nonetheless share the recognition that the human being is not a self-sufficient, isolated entity, but a fundamentally relational being existing in a web of connection with others. The experience of loneliness, despite the universal human need for connection that it reflects, has become increasingly prevalent in the contemporary world. The contemporary research has documented a substantial increase in the prevalence of loneliness across recent decades, with the increase being associated with various features of contemporary life, including the decline of traditional community structures, the increase in solitary living, time, and the transformation of social interaction through digital technologies. The phenomenon has been described by various researchers and public health authorities as a loneliness epidemic, with the prevalence of loneliness reaching levels that represent a significant public health concern. The American political scientist Robert Putnam documented the decline of community engagement in the United States in his influential 2000 book Bowling Alone, which examined the decline across the latter half of the 20th century of the social structures through which Americans had traditionally connected with one another, from civic organizations to community groups to informal social gatherings. The work documented a substantial decline in the social connections that had traditionally bound communities together, a decline that the subsequent research has associated with the increase in loneliness and social isolation. The contemporary research has examined the various factors that contribute to the prevalence of loneliness, with attention to the ways in which the structures of contemporary life can isolate individuals even in the midst of apparent connection. The phenomenon is particularly striking in an age of unprecedented technological connection, in which individuals are able to communicate instantly with others across the globe, and yet report feeling more isolated than ever before. The research has examined the complex relationship between digital connection and loneliness, with some studies suggesting that certain forms of digital interaction may contribute to loneliness rather than alleviating it, replacing the deeper forms of connection that the human being requires with shallower forms that fail to satisfy the fundamental need. The paradox of feeling alone in an age of connection bears consideration alongside the deeper paradox that this investigation will examine, the paradox of feeling separate in a universe that, at the deepest level, the contemporary physics has been revealing to be profoundly interconnected. The feeling of separateness, real and painful as it is, exists alongside a deeper interconnectedness that both the contemporary physics and the contemplative traditions have been uncovering, an interconnectedness that does not eliminate the feeling of separateness, but that bears on the question of what the feeling of separateness ultimately means. The contemplative traditions have developed extensive frameworks for understanding the relationship between solitude and connection, frameworks that bear consideration alongside the contemporary scientific understanding of loneliness. The traditions have distinguished, in various ways, between the painful experience of loneliness and the chosen experience of solitude, between the isolation that the human being suffers and the solitude that the human being may embrace as a path to deeper connection. The Christian tradition developed an extensive framework for understanding solitude through the tradition of the desert fathers and mothers. The early Christian ascetics who withdrew into the deserts of Egypt and Syria in the 3rd and 4th centuries to pursue a life of prayer and contemplation. The tradition began with figures including Antony the Great, who withdrew into the Egyptian desert around the end of the 3rd century, and whose life, recorded by Athanasius of Alexandria, became one of the foundational texts of the Christian monastic tradition. The framework held that the withdrawal into solitude was not a withdrawal from connection, but a path to a deeper connection with God and, through God, with all of creation. The desert ascetics understood their solitude not as isolation, but as a form of communion, a withdrawal from the distractions of ordinary social life that opened the way to a deeper communion with the divine reality. The tradition articulated the paradox that the deepest connection may be found through solitude, that the withdrawal from the distractions of ordinary social life may open the way to a deeper communion with the divine reality that underlies all things. The sayings of the Desert Fathers, collected in the texts known as the Apophthegmata Patrum, preserve the wisdom of these ascetics on the relationship between solitude and connection, with the recurring recognition that the solitude of the desert was a path to a communion deeper than any that the ordinary social world could provide. The framework was developed further through the subsequent Christian monastic tradition, with the tradition of hesychasm in the Eastern Orthodox Church, articulating an extensive framework for the contemplative practice through which the solitary monk could attain union with God. The hesychast tradition, developed across centuries and articulated most fully by Gregory Palamas in the 14th century, held that the solitary practice of contemplative prayer could lead to the direct experience of the divine light, a union with God that represented the deepest possible connection. The framework bears consideration alongside the contemporary scientific recognition of the human need for connection, with the contemplative tradition suggesting that the connection that the human being most deeply needs may be a connection that transcends the ordinary social connections that the contemporary science has studied. The frameworks differ substantially in their specific commitments. The contemporary science studies the human need for social connection and the measurable effects of social isolation. The contemplative tradition articulates a deeper connection with the divine reality that may be found through solitude. The frameworks nonetheless both engage the fundamental question of the relationship between the human being and that which lies beyond the isolated self. The contemplative tradition does not deny the human need for connection that the contemporary science has documented. The tradition rather suggests that the deepest connection that the human being seeks is a connection that the ordinary social world points toward but cannot fully provide, a connection with a divine reality that the solitary contemplative practice may open. The distinction between loneliness and solitude bears careful articulation. Loneliness is the painful experience of feeling cut off from others, the suffering that the human being experiences when the fundamental need for connection is unmet. Solitude is the experience of being alone, which may be painful or may be chosen and embraced as a path to deeper reflection and connection. The contemplative traditions have recognized that solitude, embraced rather than suffered, may be a path to a deeper connection that the ordinary distractions of social life can impede. The recognition does not diminish the reality of the suffering that loneliness causes. The recognition rather suggests that the relationship between being alone and feeling alone is more complex than the ordinary understanding assumes, and that the human being may, through certain practices and orientations, transform the experience of being alone from the suffering of loneliness into the deeper connection that solitude may open. The contemporary research has examined this distinction, with the work of various researchers establishing that the subjective experience of loneliness, rather than the objective fact of being alone, is what produces the harmful effects on health and well-being. An individual may be objectively alone yet not feel lonely, finding in solitude a source of reflection and renewal rather than a source of suffering. An individual may be surrounded by others yet feel profoundly lonely, experiencing the suffering of disconnection even in the midst of apparent connection. The research has established that it is the subjective sense of disconnection, rather than the objective number of social contacts, that determines whether an individual experiences the harmful effects of loneliness. The finding bears consideration alongside the contemplative recognition that the quality of connection matters more than the quantity, that a single deep connection may satisfy the human need for communion more fully than countless shallow ones, and that the human being may find in solitude a connection deeper than the ordinary social world provides. The distinction between the objective fact of being alone and the subjective experience of loneliness bears consideration alongside the contemplative frameworks that have distinguished between solitude as a path and isolation as a suffering. The American Trappist monk, Thomas Merton, who lived much of his life in monastic solitude and who wrote extensively on the contemplative life, articulated the distinction through his recognition that true solitude is not a withdrawal from others, but a deeper way of being present to them, a solitude that opens rather than closes the heart to the communion that the human being most deeply seeks. The framework suggests that the transformation of loneliness into solitude is not the elimination of the need for connection, but the discovery of a connection deeper than the one whose absence the loneliness had signaled. The Hindu tradition developed frameworks for understanding solitude through the various stages of life that the tradition articulated, with the later stages of life involving a progressive withdrawal from social engagement toward a deeper reflection on the ultimate questions of existence. The framework of the 4 ashramas, the 4 stages of life, articulated a progression from the stage of the student, the brahmacharya, through the stage of the householder, the grihastha, to the stage of the forest dweller, the vanaprastha, and finally, the stage of the renunciate, the sannyasa, with the later stages involving a progressive withdrawal from social engagement toward a deeper pursuit of the ultimate reality. The framework held that the withdrawal into solitude in the later stages of life was not a withdrawal from meaning, but a movement toward the deepest meaning, a turning from the social engagements of the householder stage toward the contemplative pursuit of the ultimate reality. The framework recognized that the human being passes through stages in which the orientation towards social connection is appropriate and necessary, the stages of the student and the householder, in which the human being is engaged in learning, in raising a family, and in contributing to the social world. The framework recognized as well that the human being may, in the later stages of life, turn toward a deeper pursuit that the social engagements of the earlier stages had not permitted, a pursuit of the ultimate reality that the contemplative solitude makes possible. The framework bears consideration alongside the contemporary scientific understanding of the human need for connection, with the Hindu tradition suggesting that the connection that the human being most deeply needs may, in the later stages of life, be a connection with the ultimate reality that the contemplative pursuit seeks. The frameworks differ substantially in their specific commitments. The contemporary science studies the human need for social connection across the lifespan. The Hindu tradition articulates a progression toward a deeper connection with the ultimate reality through the progressive withdrawal from social engagement. The frameworks nonetheless both engage the fundamental question of the relationship between the human being and that which the human being most deeply seeks. The Daoist tradition similarly developed frameworks for understanding solitude, with the figure of the hermit sage who withdraws into the mountains to cultivate harmony with the Tao, representing a recurring ideal in the Daoist tradition. The Daoist framework treated the withdrawal into solitude not as a withdrawal from connection, but as a movement toward a deeper alignment with the patterns of Tao that organize all things, with the hermit sage being understood as one who, through solitude, attains a deeper communion with the cosmic patterns than the engagements of ordinary social life permit. The framework bears consideration alongside the other contemplative frameworks for solitude, with the Daoist tradition contributing a distinctive perspective on the relationship between withdrawal from social engagement and connection with the deeper patterns of reality. The investigation that this stage has opened will be developed across the subsequent stages of this examination. The next stage will examine what contemporary physics has revealed about the deep interconnectedness of the universe at the quantum level, with attention to the phenomenon of quantum entanglement and the broader framework of non-locality that the contemporary physics has been uncovering. The phenomenon of quantum entanglement, in which particles that have interacted remain correlated in ways that transcend the ordinary separation of space, bears consideration alongside the question of the relationship between the apparent separateness of individual beings and the deeper interconnectedness that the contemporary physics has been revealing. The phenomenon was the subject of a famous dispute between Albert Einstein and the broader physics community, with Einstein describing the apparent connection between entangled particles as spooky action at a distance, and the subsequent experimental work establishing that the connection is real, that particles that have interacted remain correlated in ways that the ordinary understanding of separation cannot accommodate. The subsequent stages will examine how the great philosophical and contemplative traditions have understood the relationship between separateness and connection, with attention to the specific frameworks that the Christian, Hindu, Buddhist, and Daoist traditions have developed across the centuries. The question of whether we are, at the deepest level, alone, is one of the deepest questions that a human being can ask, and it is a question that bears on the experience of loneliness that is among the most universal of human experiences. The feeling of loneliness is real, and the suffering that it causes is real. The contemporary science has established that the human being is fundamentally relational, that the need for connection is as deep as the need for food and water, and that the human being flourishes in communion and suffers in isolation. The contemplative traditions have articulated that the human being is oriented toward a connection deeper than the ordinary social world provides, a connection with the divine reality, or the ultimate truth that the traditions have variously named. What the deeper structure of reality might suggest about the relationship between the separateness that we feel and the connection that we long for is the question that the investigation will continue to examine. The investigation continues. At the deepest level that physics has been able to probe, the universe is not made of separate things. This is one of the more profound implications of the quantum physics that has developed across the past century, and it stands in striking tension with the ordinary understanding of the world as a collection of separate objects existing independently of one another. The ordinary understanding holds that the world is made of separate things, each occupying its own location in space, each existing independently of the others, connected only through the physical forces that act between them across the distances that separate them. This understanding is deeply embedded in the way we experience the world, and it serves well for nearly all the ordinary purposes of life. The chair across the room is a separate thing from the table beside it. The person across the street is a separate being from the person walking past. The ordinary world presents itself as a collection of separate things, each bounded by its own surface, each existing in its own place, each fundamentally separate from all the others. The quantum physics has revealed that this understanding, however well it serves for the ordinary purposes of life, does not hold at the deepest level. At the quantum level, particles that have once interacted remain connected in ways that transcend the ordinary separation of space, correlated in their behavior across any distance in a manner that the ordinary understanding of separate things cannot accommodate. The phenomenon is called quantum entanglement, and it is among the most thoroughly established and most deeply puzzling features of the physical world. The investigation that this stage will pursue concerns the relationship between this deep interconnectedness that the quantum physics has revealed and the experience of separateness that is central to the human experience of loneliness. The investigation does not claim that quantum entanglement explains or eliminates the experience of loneliness, or that the connection between entangled particles is the same kind of connection that the human being longs for. The connection between entangled particles is a specific physical phenomenon, and the relationship between this phenomenon and the human experience of connection and separation is a question that requires careful and honest examination, rather than the easy conflation that the popular treatments often offer. What the investigation will suggest is that the deep interconnectedness that the quantum physics has revealed bears consideration alongside the frameworks that the great contemplative traditions have developed for understanding the relationship between the apparent separateness of individual beings and the deeper interconnectedness that the traditions have variously articulated. The traditions have held, across millennia, that the apparent separateness of individual beings is not the deepest truth about reality, that beneath the surface of separation there is a deeper interconnectedness that the contemplative practice may reveal. The quantum physics has revealed, through entirely different methods, that the apparent separateness of physical things is not the deepest truth about the physical world. The convergence between these recognitions is striking, even as the relationship between them requires careful examination. The phenomenon of quantum entanglement was first identified through a famous thought experiment proposed by Albert Einstein together with his collaborators Boris Podolsky and Nathan Rosen in 1935, in a paper published in the journal Physical Review under the title, "Can Quantum Mechanical Description of Physical Reality Be Considered Complete?" The paper, which came to be known by the initials of its authors as the EPR paper, was intended by Einstein as a critique of quantum mechanics, an argument that the theory must be incomplete because it implied a phenomenon that Einstein found impossible to accept. Einstein had been among the founders of quantum mechanics, having received the Nobel Prize for his explanation of the photoelectric effect, one of the foundational discoveries of the quantum theory. He had nonetheless become increasingly uncomfortable with the direction that quantum mechanics had taken, and particularly with the apparent abandonment of the principle that physical reality exists definitely and independently of observation. The EPR paper articulated his discomfort through a specific argument concerning the behavior of two particles that have interacted and then separated. The phenomenon was the prediction that two particles that have interacted and then separated would remain correlated in their properties in a manner that transcends the ordinary separation of space, such that a measurement performed on one particle would instantaneously determine the corresponding property of the other particle, no matter how far apart they had become. Einstein found this prediction impossible to accept, since it appeared to require an instantaneous influence between the particles across any distance, an influence that would violate the principle central to his theory of relativity, that no influence can travel faster than the speed of light. Einstein described the apparent influence as spooky action at a distance, the phrase he used in his correspondence to express his discomfort with the apparent connection between the particles, and he argued that the prediction of such an influence demonstrated that quantum mechanics must be incomplete, that there must be additional features of reality, which came to be called hidden variables, that would account for the correlation between the particles without requiring any instantaneous influence between them. The EPR paper articulated the framework that the particles must have possessed definite properties all along, properties that the measurement merely revealed rather than determined, in the same way that two gloves separated into two boxes are each definitely a left glove or a right glove all along, such that opening one box and finding a left glove immediately reveals that the other box contains a right glove without any influence passing between the boxes. The argument was a profound one, articulated by one of the greatest physicists in history, and it framed the question that would occupy the foundations of quantum mechanics for the subsequent decades. The dispute between Einstein and the broader physics community over the interpretation of quantum entanglement remained unresolved for nearly 3 decades. Treated by many physicists as a matter of philosophical interpretation that could not be settled experimentally, the situation changed dramatically through the work of the Northern Irish physicist John Stuart Bell, who in 1964 published a paper that transformed the dispute from a matter of philosophical interpretation into a question that could be settled experimentally. Bell, who was working at the European Organization for Nuclear Research known as CERN, had a deep interest in the foundations of quantum mechanics, an interest that was somewhat unusual among working physicists of his time, many of whom regarded the foundational questions as matters of philosophy rather than physics. Bell pursued the foundational questions in his spare time, apart from his official work on particle physics and his 1964 paper, published in the short-lived journal Physics under the title On the Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen Paradox, became one of the most significant contributions to the foundations of physics in the 20th century. Bell demonstrated through a rigorous mathematical analysis that the predictions of quantum mechanics differ from the predictions of any theory of the kind that Einstein had envisioned, any theory in which the particles possess definite properties all along, that the measurement merely reveals. Bell's theorem established that if the particles possess definite properties all along, as Einstein's hidden variable framework required, then the correlations between the measurements performed on the two particles would have to satisfy a specific mathematical constraint, which came to be called Bell's inequality. Quantum mechanics, by contrast, predicted that the correlations would violate this constraint under certain conditions. The theorem transformed the dispute into an experimental question, since it established that the two frameworks made different predictions that could be tested by experiment. If the correlations satisfied Bell's inequality, then Einstein's framework of definite properties and hidden variables would be vindicated, and the apparent connection between the particles would be revealed as an artifact of the particles having possessed definite properties all along. If the correlations violated Bell's inequality, then quantum mechanics would be vindicated, and the deep interconnectedness of entangled particles would be established as a genuine feature of physical reality rather than an artifact of an incomplete theory. The theorem was a remarkable achievement, transforming a question that had seemed to be a matter of irresolvable philosophical interpretation into a precise experimental question with a definite answer. The experimental tests of Bell's inequality were conducted across the subsequent decades, with increasingly precise experiments establishing that the correlations between entangled particles do indeed violate Bell's inequality, in agreement with the predictions of quantum mechanics and in contradiction to the framework of definite properties and hidden variables that Einstein had envisioned. The first significant experimental tests were conducted by the American physicist John Clauser in the early 1970s, with his experiments providing the first experimental evidence that the correlations violate Bell's inequality. The most influential of the early experiments were conducted by the French physicist Alain Aspect at the University of Paris in the early 1980s, with his experiments published in 1982, providing the most rigorous experimental confirmation, up to that time, that the correlations between entangled particles violate Bell's inequality. Aspects experiments were particularly significant because they included a crucial refinement: the rapid switching of the measurement settings while the particles were in flight, which closed a loophole through which the particles might have somehow coordinated their behavior in advance. By switching the measurement settings while the particles were in flight, too quickly for any signal traveling at the speed of light to pass between them, Aspects experiments established that the correlation between the particles could not be explained by any influence passing between them at or below the speed of light. The experiments established that the deep interconnectedness of entangled particles is a genuine feature of physical reality, that particles that have interacted remain correlated in ways that transcend the ordinary separation of space, and that this correlation cannot be explained by any framework in which the particles possess definite properties all along. The work was developed further through subsequent experiments that progressively closed the various remaining loopholes through which the framework of hidden variables might have been preserved, with the experiments of the Austrian physicist Anton Zeilinger contributing substantially to the increasingly definitive establishment of the phenomenon. Zeilinger's experiments included tests over increasingly large distances, including tests between the Canary Islands and tests involving satellites, establishing that the entanglement persists across distances of many kilometers and confirming the deep interconnectedness of the quantum world across the vast distances that the experiments probed. The significance of this work was recognized by the award of the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2022 to Aspect, Clauser, and Zeilinger for their experimental work on quantum entanglement, an award that recognized the establishment of the deep interconnectedness of the quantum world as one of the more significant achievements of contemporary physics. The award marked the culmination of nearly 9 decades of inquiry into the phenomenon that Einstein had first identified in 1935, an inquiry that had transformed his critique of quantum mechanics into one of the most thoroughly established and most deeply puzzling features of the physical world. The phenomenon of quantum entanglement that this work established bears careful articulation, since the popular treatments often distort what the phenomenon actually involves. The entanglement of two particles means that the particles cannot be described independently of one another, that the state of the pair is a single unified state that cannot be decomposed into separate states for each particle. Before the measurement, neither particle possesses a definite value for the property that will be measured. The measurement of one particle is correlated with the measurement of the other in a manner that the framework of separate particles with definite properties cannot accommodate, with the two measurements showing a correlation that is stronger than any correlation that could exist between particles that possess definite properties all along. The phenomenon reveals that the two particles, however far apart they may be, constitute in some sense a single system rather than two separate systems, a single, unified whole that cannot be decomposed into independent parts. The phenomenon does not, however, allow for the transmission of any signal or information between the particles, a point that bears emphasis since the popular treatments often suggest otherwise. The correlation between the entangled particles cannot be used to send any message from one to the other, since the outcome of the measurement on each particle is random, and the correlation becomes apparent only when the results of the measurements on both particles are compared, a comparison that requires the ordinary transmission of information at or below the speed of light. An observer measuring one particle sees only a random outcome, with no way to determine whether the other particle has been measured or what the result of that measurement was, until the results are compared through ordinary communication. The phenomenon, therefore, does not violate the principle of relativity that no signal can travel faster than light, despite the deep correlation between the particles that transcends the ordinary separation of space. The phenomenon establishes that the particles are connected in a manner that the framework of separate things cannot accommodate, while not allowing for any faster-than-light transmission of signals or information. The careful articulation of what the phenomenon does and does not involve is essential to the honest engagement with its implications, since the popular conflation of entanglement with faster-than-light communication or with various other claims, distorts what the phenomenon actually establishes. The phenomenon is profound enough in what it actually establishes, the deep interconnectedness of particles that the framework of separate things cannot accommodate, without the need for the exaggerations that the popular treatments often add. The deep interconnectedness that the quantum physics has revealed bears consideration alongside the frameworks that the great contemplative traditions have developed for understanding the interconnectedness of all things. The Buddhist tradition articulated the interconnectedness of all phenomena through the image of Indra's net, developed most fully in the Hawaiian school of Buddhism that flourished in China in the 7th and 8th centuries. The image describes the universe as an infinite net extending in all directions, with a jewel at each node of the net, each jewel reflecting all the other jewels in the net, such that each jewel contains within itself the reflection of the entire net, and within each reflection a further reflection of all the jewels, in an infinite regress of mutual reflection. The image articulates the framework that each thing contains and reflects all other things, that nothing exists in isolation, and that the deepest truth about reality is the infinite interconnectedness of all things. The Hawaiian master Fazang, who lived in the 7th and 8th centuries, articulated the framework through various illustrations, including a famous demonstration that he is said to have arranged for the Empress of China, in which he placed mirrors on all the walls, the ceiling, and the floor of a room, with a single statue and a lamp in the center, so that the statue was reflected infinitely in all the mirrors, each reflection containing all the others in an endless web of mutual reflection. The demonstration articulated the framework that each thing contains and reflects all other things, that the whole is present in each part, and that the apparent separateness of individual things is a surface appearance beneath which lies an infinite web of interconnection. The framework holds that the apparent separateness of individual things is a surface appearance, that beneath the surface there is an infinite web of mutual reflection and interdependence in which each thing is connected to all other things. The framework bears striking relationship to the deep interconnectedness that the quantum physics has revealed, with both the Buddhist image of Indra's net and the quantum phenomenon of entanglement articulating a connection between things that transcends the ordinary understanding of separate objects existing independently of one another. The frameworks differ substantially in their specific commitments. The Buddhist framework articulates the interconnectedness of all phenomena as a metaphysical and contemplative truth, a truth that the contemplative practice may directly reveal. The quantum framework articulates the entanglement of particles as a specific physical phenomenon established through experiment. The relationship between these frameworks requires careful examination rather than easy conflation, since the connection between entangled particles is a specific physical phenomenon, and the interconnectedness that the Buddhist tradition articulates is a metaphysical and contemplative truth, and the relationship between them is a matter for careful reflection rather than simple identification. Any bridge between the quantum phenomenon and the contemplative framework is speculative, and it should be marked clearly as speculative rather than presented as an established connection. The Christian tradition articulated the interconnectedness of all members of the community of faith through the image of the mystical body, developed most fully by the Apostle Paul in his letters to the early Christian communities. The image describes the community of faith as a single body, with Christ as the head and the members of the community as the various parts of the body, each part essential to the whole, and each connected to all the others through their shared participation in the one body. The image articulates the framework that the members of the community are not isolated individuals but are joined together in a single living whole, connected to one another through their shared participation in the deeper reality that unites them. Paul articulated the framework in his first letter to the Corinthians, composed around the middle of the 1st century, where he described the many members of the one body, each with its distinct function yet all joined together in a single living whole. such that the suffering of one member is the suffering of all, and the flourishing of one member is the flourishing of all. Paul wrote that if one member suffers, all the members suffer together, and if one member is honored, all the members rejoice together, articulating the framework that the members of the community are so deeply connected that the experience of each is shared by all. The framework was developed further across the subsequent Christian tradition, with the doctrine of the communion of saints articulating the connection between all the members of the community of faith, living and dead, joined together in a single communion that transcends the separation of space and even of time. The doctrine holds that the members of the community of faith remain connected across the boundary of death, that the living and the dead are joined together in a single communion through their shared participation in the divine reality, and that the human being is therefore never truly alone, but is always held within the communion of the whole community of faith across all space and time. The framework bears consideration, alongside the deep interconnectedness that the quantum physics has revealed, with both the Christian image of the mystical body and the quantum phenomenon of entanglement, articulating a connection between things that transcends the ordinary understanding of separate individuals existing independently of one another. The frameworks differ substantially in their specific commitments, and the relationship between them requires careful examination rather than easy conflation. The Christian framework articulates a connection between persons through their shared participation in the divine reality, a connection that is spiritual and theological rather than physical. The quantum framework articulates a connection between particles that is a specific physical phenomenon. Any bridge between them is speculative and should be marked clearly as such. The Christian framework nonetheless articulates a recognition that bears profoundly on the experience of loneliness, the recognition that the human being is, at the deepest level, held within a communion that transcends the apparent separation of individuals, a communion through which the human being is never truly alone. The Hindu tradition articulated the deepest interconnectedness of all things through the framework of Brahman, the ultimate reality that underlies and unifies all apparent multiplicity. The framework, articulated most fully in the Upanishads and developed in the Advaita Vedanta tradition of Shankara, holds that the apparent multiplicity of individual things is the surface appearance of a deeper unitary reality, that beneath the surface of separation there is a single reality, Brahman, that is the true nature of all things. The framework holds that the individual self, the Atman, is ultimately identical with the universal reality of Brahman, that the apparent separateness of individual selves is a misperception, and that the deepest truth is the unity of all things in the single reality of Brahman. The framework was articulated through the great sayings of the Upanishads, including the saying from the Chandogya Upanishad that thou art that, tat tvamasi, which articulates the identity between the individual self and the ultimate reality, and the saying that all this is Brahman, which articulates the presence of the ultimate reality in all things. The framework articulates the most radical form of interconnectedness, in which the apparent separateness of individual things is not merely transcended by a deeper connection, but is ultimately dissolved in the recognition of the single reality that all things are. The recognition of this unity on the Advaitic framework is liberating, since it releases the individual from the isolation of the separate self into the recognition of identity with the ultimate reality that is the true nature of all things. The framework bears profoundly on the experience of loneliness, since it suggests that the deepest truth about the self is not its separateness, but its identity with the ultimate reality that unites all things, and that the experience of separation that underlies loneliness is, on this framework, a misperception of the deeper unity. The framework bears consideration alongside the deep interconnectedness that the quantum physics has revealed, though the relationship between them requires particularly careful examination, since the Hindu framework articulates not merely a connection between separate things, but the ultimate dissolution of separateness in the recognition of a single underlying reality. The quantum framework, by contrast, articulates a connection between particles that remain in some sense distinct even as they are entangled. The relationship between the radical non-dualism of the Advaitic framework and the quantum phenomenon of entanglement is a matter for careful reflection, and any bridge between them is speculative and should be marked clearly as such. The convergence between the contemplative recognition of a deeper interconnectedness and the quantum revelation of a connection that transcends ordinary separation is striking, even as the specific frameworks differ substantially and the relationship between them requires careful and honest examination. The popular discussions of quantum entanglement and its relationship to the human experience of connection have often distorted what the physics actually shows. The popular framework that holds that quantum entanglement establishes a literal connection between human beings, or that the entanglement of particles in the brain establishes a physical basis for telepathy, or for various other claimed phenomena, draws specific implications from the physics that the physics itself does not support. The legitimate physics establishes that particles that have interacted remain correlated in ways that transcend the ordinary separation of space, while not allowing for any transmission of signals or information between them. The physics does not establish that human beings are connected through quantum entanglement in any manner that would explain the experience of connection or alleviate the experience of loneliness, or that the entanglement of particles provides a physical basis for any form of communication or connection between separated minds. The popular framework that conflates the legitimate physics of entanglement with claims about human connection does not survive careful examination. The framework has been criticized by serious physicists, including Sean Carroll at Johns Hopkins University, who has written extensively on the proper interpretation of quantum mechanics and on the various ways in which the popular treatments distort what the physics actually establishes. The specific popular claim that the entanglement of particles in the brain provides a physical basis for telepathy, or for a literal connection between minds, has no support in the legitimate physics. Since entanglement is extraordinarily fragile and is rapidly destroyed by interaction with the environment, a process that we will examine in the next stage, and since entanglement in any case does not allow for the transmission of any signal or information, the specific popular claim that quantum entanglement establishes that we are all literally connected through quantum correlations, and that this connection provides a physical basis for various claimed phenomena of connection between separated individuals, similarly goes beyond what the physics establishes. The careful position is to engage with what the physics actually establishes about the deep interconnectedness of the quantum world, while engaging the broader questions about human connection and the experience of loneliness through whatever philosophical and contemplative resources may be relevant, maintaining the distinction between the specific physical phenomenon of entanglement and the broader questions about connection and separation that the contemplative traditions have addressed. The deep interconnectedness that the quantum physics has revealed is genuinely striking, and it bears consideration alongside the contemplative frameworks for interconnectedness. But the relationship between the physical phenomenon and the contemplative frameworks is a matter for careful reflection rather than easy conflation, and any bridge between them is speculative and should be marked clearly as such. What the physics does establish, beyond any reasonable doubt, is that the ordinary understanding of the world as a collection of entirely separate things, existing independently of one another, is not the deepest truth about the physical world. At the deepest level, the world is more interconnected than the ordinary understanding assumes. This recognition, established through the rigorous methods of experimental physics, bears consideration alongside the contemplative recognition of a deeper interconnectedness, even as the relationship between the two recognitions requires the careful examination that the honest engagement with these questions demands. The investigation will continue in the subsequent stages with examination of the question of why, given the deep interconnectedness that the quantum physics has revealed, the human being experiences the world as a collection of separate things and experiences the self as separate from others. The next stage will examine the relationship between the deep interconnectedness of the quantum world and the apparent separateness of the macroscopic world of ordinary experience, with attention to the phenomenon of decoherence, through which the deep quantum interconnectedness gives way to the apparent separateness of the classical world. The phenomenon of decoherence, through which the fragile quantum connections are destroyed by interaction with the environment, explains why the ordinary world of large objects presents itself as a collection of separate things, despite the deep interconnectedness that underlies it at the quantum level. The relationship between the deep interconnectedness of the quantum world and the apparent separateness of ordinary experience bears directly on the question of the relationship between the connection that the contemplative traditions articulate and the separation that is central to the human experience of loneliness. The question of whether we are, at the deepest level, alone or connected, is one of the deepest questions that a human being can ask. The quantum physics has revealed a deep interconnectedness at the foundation of the physical world, an interconnectedness established through nearly a century of inquiry and confirmed through the most rigorous experimental methods. The contemplative traditions have articulated a deep interconnectedness at the foundation of reality, an interconnectedness that the contemplative practice may reveal, and that the traditions have articulated through frameworks developed across millennia. The experience of loneliness, real and painful as it is, exists alongside these deeper interconnectednesses in a relationship that the investigation will continue to examine. The feeling of separateness is real, and it is not dismissed by the recognition of a deeper interconnectedness. What the deeper interconnectedness might mean for the experience of separateness, and whether the recognition of the deeper interconnectedness might bear on the experience of loneliness, is a question that the investigation will continue to examine with the care that the question deserves. The investigation continues. If the universe is so deeply interconnected at the quantum level, why do we experience it as a world of separate things? This is the question that lies at the heart of this stage of the investigation, and it is a question that bears directly on the experience of separateness that is central to the experience of loneliness. The previous stage examined the deep interconnectedness that the quantum physics has revealed, the entanglement of particles that transcends the ordinary separation of space and that establishes the world, at the deepest level, as something other than a collection of entirely separate things. And yet the world of ordinary experience does not present itself as deeply interconnected. The world of ordinary experience presents itself as a collection of separate things, each bounded by its own surface, each existing in its own place, each fundamentally separate from all the others. The chair is separate from the table, the person is separate from the others around them. The self is experienced as separate from the world and from other selves, enclosed within the boundary of the individual body and the individual mind. This experience of separateness is so fundamental to ordinary experience that it is rarely questioned, taken as simply the way things are. The obvious truth that the world is made of separate things, and that the self is one separate thing among the others, and it is this experience of separateness that underlies the experience of loneliness, the sense of being one separate self among others, cut off by the boundary of the individual being from the connection that the human being longs for. The lonely person feels themselves enclosed within a boundary that no one else can cross, sealed within the privacy of their own experience, unable to fully reach or be reached by the others, who seem to move through the world in an easy communion. The boundary of the self, which is the precondition of all individual experience, can become the wall of a prison, the barrier that separates the lonely person from the connection they most deeply need. The experience is among the most painful that a human being can undergo, and it raises the question of whether the separateness that the lonely person feels is the deepest truth about what they are, or whether the boundary that seems so absolute is, at some deeper level, more permeable than it appears. The question of why the deeply interconnected quantum world gives rise to the apparently separate world of ordinary experience is one of the central questions of the foundations of quantum mechanics, and it has been substantially illuminated by the contemporary understanding of the phenomenon called decoherence. The question bears as well on the deeper question that this investigation has been pursuing, the question of the relationship between the apparent separateness that is central to the experience of loneliness and the deeper interconnectedness that both the quantum physics and the contemplative traditions have been uncovering. The contemplative traditions have held, across millennia, that the experience of the self as fundamentally separate is in some sense a misperception, that the boundary between the self and the world, and between the self and other selves, is not as absolute as it appears, and that the recognition of the deeper interconnectedness beneath the apparent separation is among the deepest insights that the contemplative practice may yield. The relationship between this contemplative recognition and the physical understanding of why the interconnected quantum world gives rise to the apparently separate classical world is a question that this stage will examine, with attention always to the genuine complexity of the relationship and to the honest acknowledgement of what remains uncertain. The phenomenon of decoherence provides the contemporary physical understanding of why the deeply interconnected quantum world gives rise to the apparently separate world of ordinary experience. The phenomenon was substantially developed through the work of the German physicist Heinz-Dieter Zeh, who in 1970 published a paper in the journal Foundations of Physics that first articulated the framework, and the Polish-American physicist Wojciech Jurek at Los Alamos National Laboratory, who developed the framework substantially across the subsequent decades through a series of influential papers beginning in the 1980s. The framework was developed further through the work of Eric Hughes, who collaborated with Zeh on the detailed elaboration of the framework, and through the work of various other physicists who established decoherence as one of the central frameworks for understanding the relationship between the quantum and classical worlds. The framework addresses the question of why the strange features of the quantum world, including the entanglement and the superposition of states that characterize quantum systems, are not apparent in the world of ordinary experience. The superposition of states, one of the central features of the quantum world, holds that a quantum system can exist in a combination of multiple states at once, in a manner that has no counterpart in the world of ordinary experience, where objects are always in one definite state or another. The answer that the framework provides concerns the interaction of quantum systems with their environment. A quantum system that is perfectly isolated from its environment can maintain the strange features of the quantum world, including the superposition of states and the entanglement with other systems. But no macroscopic system is ever perfectly isolated from its environment. Every macroscopic system is constantly interacting with its environment, with the countless particles of air, the photons of light, and the other features of the surrounding world. Each of these interactions, however small, entangles the system with the environment, spreading the quantum information of the system out into the vast number of particles that constitute the environment. The framework demonstrates that this constant interaction with the environment rapidly destroys the strange quantum features, causing the quantum superpositions to give way to the definite states of the classical world, and causing the entanglement between the system and other systems to be replaced by entanglement between the system and the vast environment. The process is extraordinarily rapid for macroscopic systems, occurring on timescales far shorter than any that could be observed, with calculations showing that even a single dust particle interacting with the surrounding light and air decoheres in a tiny fraction of a second, which is why the strange quantum features are never apparent in the world of ordinary experience. The framework has been confirmed experimentally through a series of increasingly precise experiments that have observed the process of decoherence in carefully controlled systems, establishing decoherence as one of the well-confirmed frameworks of contemporary physics. The experiments have included the observation of the gradual loss of quantum coherence in systems of increasing size, with researchers able to observe the transition from the quantum behavior characteristic of small isolated systems to the classical behavior characteristic of larger systems interacting with their environment. The experimental work has confirmed the central prediction of the framework, that the loss of quantum coherence occurs more rapidly as the system becomes larger and as its interaction with the environment becomes greater, in precise agreement with the calculations that the framework provides. The framework has thereby moved from a theoretical proposal to a well-established understanding of the relationship between the quantum and classical worlds, an understanding that explains why the strange features of the quantum world, including the deep interconnectedness that the previous stage examined, they are not apparent in the world of ordinary experience, even though they remain present at the deepest level of physical reality. The framework of decoherence bears on the question of separateness in a manner that is both subtle and profound. The framework demonstrates that the apparent separateness of the macroscopic world is not a fundamental feature of reality, but an emergent consequence of the interaction of quantum systems with their environment. At the deepest level, the world remains the deeply interconnected quantum world that the previous stage examined. The apparent separateness of the macroscopic world emerges from this deeper interconnectedness through the process of decoherence, through which the quantum connections between systems are not eliminated, but are spread out into the vast environment in a manner that makes them undetectable in practice. The framework, therefore, suggests that the separateness that characterizes the world of ordinary experience is, in a certain sense, a surface appearance, an emergent consequence of the deeper interconnectedness rather than a fundamental feature of reality. The deeper interconnectedness is not eliminated by decoherence, but is, in a sense, hidden by it, spread out into the environment in a manner that makes the world appear to be a collection of separate things, despite the deeper interconnectedness that underlies it. This recognition bears on one of the deepest puzzles in the foundations of quantum mechanics, the measurement problem, which concerns the question of how the definite outcomes of measurement emerge from the indefinite superpositions that characterize quantum systems. The decoherence framework provides part of the answer to this puzzle, explaining how the interaction with the environment causes the superpositions to give way to the definite states of the classical world, though the complete resolution of the measurement problem remains a matter of ongoing inquiry and debate among physicists. The role of the observer in the measurement process has been the subject of extensive discussion across the history of quantum mechanics, with some interpretations assigning a special role to consciousness or observation in the emergence of definite outcomes, and other interpretations, including the decoherence framework, explaining the emergence of definite outcomes through the interaction with the environment without any special role for consciousness. The question of the role of the observer bears on the broader question of the relationship between the observing self and the observed world, a question that the contemplative traditions have examined extensively. The experience of being an observer, a center of awareness that looks out upon a world of objects, is itself one of the sources of the experience of separateness, since the observing self seems to stand apart from the world it observes, separated from it by the very act of observation. The self that experiences loneliness is precisely this observing self, the center of awareness that looks out upon a world of others from whom it feels separated, enclosed within the privacy of its own perspective. The contemplative traditions have examined this structure of the observing self with great care, recognizing that the sense of standing apart as a separate observer is among the deepest features of ordinary experience and among the deepest sources of the sense of separation. Whether the observing self is as fundamentally separate from the observed world as it seems, or whether the apparent separation between the observer and the observed is itself a kind of appearance that conceals a deeper unity, is a question that the contemplative traditions have addressed through their various frameworks, and it is a question that bears profoundly on the experience of loneliness that arises within the observing self. The framework bears striking relationship to the contemplative recognition that the experience of the self as fundamentally separate is in some sense a surface appearance, that beneath the apparent separation there is a deeper interconnectedness that the ordinary experience obscures. The frameworks differ substantially in their specific commitments. The framework of decoherence is a specific physical account of why the quantum interconnectedness is not apparent in the macroscopic world. The contemplative recognition is a claim about the nature of the self and its relationship to the deeper reality. The relationship between them requires careful examination rather than easy conflation, and any bridge between them is speculative and should be marked clearly as such. The convergence is nonetheless striking, with both the physical framework and the contemplative recognition articulating a deeper interconnectedness beneath the apparent separateness of ordinary experience. The experience of the self as fundamentally separate, which is central to the experience of loneliness, has been examined extensively by the contemplative traditions, which have developed frameworks for understanding the apparent separateness of the self and the deeper interconnectedness that may lie beneath it. The Buddhist tradition articulated the framework most fully through its analysis of the self and the sense of separateness that the self produces. The Buddhist tradition holds that the sense of being a separate self, enclosed within the boundary of the individual being and fundamentally separate from all others, is produced by a specific mental process that the tradition analyzes in detail. The Sanskrit term ahamkara, conventionally translated as the I-maker or the ego, refers to the mental process through which the sense of a separate self is constructed, the process through which the flow of experience is organized around the sense of a self that is separate from the world and from others. The term derives from aham, meaning I, and kara, meaning maker, articulating the framework that the sense of a separate self is not a given but is continuously made, continuously constructed through the mental process that organizes experience around the sense of a separate I. The framework holds that this sense of a separate self is not the deepest truth about what we are, but a construction, a mental process that produces the experience of separateness that underlies so much of human suffering, including the suffering of loneliness. The Buddhist tradition holds that the suffering of the human being arises largely from the attachment to this constructed sense of a separate self, from the grasping and the aversion that the sense of a separate self produces, and that the recognition of the constructed nature of the separate self is therefore a path to the release from suffering. The framework holds that the recognition of the constructed nature of the separate self, achieved through the contemplative practice, may release the human being from the suffering that the sense of separateness produces, opening the way to a recognition of the deeper interconnectedness that the sense of separateness obscures. The Buddhist contemplative practices, including the practices of mindfulness and meditation that the tradition has developed across millennia, are designed in part to reveal the constructed nature of the separate self and to open the way to the recognition of the deeper interconnectedness, a recognition that the tradition holds to be liberating rather than threatening. The framework bears striking relationship to the physical understanding of decoherence, with both the Buddhist analysis of the constructed nature of the separate self and the physical account of the emergent nature of macroscopic separateness, articulating a deeper interconnectedness beneath the apparent separation. The frameworks differ substantially in their specific commitments. The Buddhist framework is a contemplative and psychological analysis of the construction of the sense of a separate self. The physical framework is an account of why the quantum interconnectedness is not apparent in the macroscopic world. The relationship between them requires careful examination, and any bridge between them is speculative and should be marked clearly as such. The convergence is nonetheless striking, with both frameworks articulating a deeper interconnectedness beneath the apparent separateness that ordinary experience presents. The Hindu tradition articulated the apparent separateness of the self through the framework of Maya, conventionally translated as illusion, which refers to the cosmic process through which the single underlying reality appears as the manifold world of separate things. The framework holds that the apparent multiplicity of the world, including the apparent separateness of individual selves, is the surface appearance of the single underlying reality of Brahman, an appearance produced by the cosmic process of Maya, through which the one appears as the many. The translation of Maya as illusion can be misleading, since the framework does not hold that the world is unreal in the sense of not existing, but that the apparent separateness of the world is a surface appearance that obscures the deeper unity that is the true nature of all things. The world is real as an appearance, but the appearance of separateness is not the deepest truth about it. The framework was developed most fully in the Advaita Vedanta tradition of Shankara, who articulated the relationship between the apparent multiplicity of the world and the single underlying reality through the analysis of the various levels of truth, with the apparent separateness of the world being true at the conventional level of ordinary experience, while the deeper unity of all things in Brahman is true at the ultimate level that the contemplative realization reveals. Shankara used various illustrations to articulate the framework, including the famous illustration of the rope mistaken for a snake, in which a person in dim light mistakes a coiled rope for a snake and experiences fear, the fear being real, even though the snake is not, until the recognition that the object is a rope dispels the fear. The illustration articulates the framework that the apparent separateness of the world, like the apparent snake, is a misperception of the underlying reality, and that the recognition of the underlying reality, like the recognition of the rope, dispels the misperception and the suffering that it produces. The framework holds that the recognition of the deeper unity beneath the apparent separateness, achieved through the contemplative practice and the realization of the identity between the individual self and the universal reality, releases the human being from the bondage to the apparent separateness and opens the way to the recognition of the deeper unity that is the true nature of all things. The framework bears consideration alongside the physical understanding of the emergent nature of macroscopic separateness, with both the Hindu framework of Maya and the physical account of decoherence, articulating a deeper unity or interconnectedness beneath the apparent separateness of the world. The frameworks differ substantially in their specific commitments. The Hindu framework articulates the apparent separateness of the world as the surface appearance of a single underlying reality, a metaphysical claim about the nature of reality. The physical framework articulates the apparent separateness of the macroscopic world as an emergent consequence of decoherence, a specific physical account. The relationship between them requires careful examination, and any bridge between them is speculative and should be marked clearly as such. The convergence is nonetheless striking, with both frameworks articulating a deeper reality beneath the apparent separateness that ordinary experience presents. The Christian tradition articulated the apparent separation of the human being through the framework of the fall, the doctrine that the original communion between the human being and God and among human beings has been disrupted by the fall into sin, producing the experience of separation and alienation that characterizes the fallen human condition. The framework holds that the human being was created for communion, for a connection with God and with other human beings that the fall has disrupted, and that the experience of separation and alienation that characterizes human life is a consequence of this disruption, rather than the deepest truth about what the human being is. The framework articulates the experience of separation as a wound in the human condition, a disruption of the communion for which the human being was created, rather than as the natural and final state of the human being. The Christian theological tradition has articulated the various dimensions of this separation, the separation of the human being from God, the separation of human beings from one another, and even the separation of the human being from their own deepest self, all understood as consequences of the disruption of the original communion. The framework holds that the restoration of the original communion, made possible through the redemptive work of Christ, is the deepest hope of the human being, the restoration of the connection with God and with others that the fall had disrupted. The Christian tradition articulates this restoration through the various images of reconciliation, of the healing of the wound of separation, of the gathering of the scattered into one, with the ultimate hope being the full restoration of communion in the life to come, in which the separation that characterizes the present condition is finally overcome. The framework articulates the experience of separation, including the experience of loneliness, as a consequence of the disruption of the original communion, rather than as the deepest truth about the human being, and it articulates the restoration of communion as the deepest hope and the deepest fulfillment of the human being. The framework bears consideration, alongside the physical understanding of the emergent nature of macroscopic separateness, with both the Christian framework of the fall and the physical account of decoherence, articulating the apparent separation as something other than the deepest truth about reality. The frameworks differ substantially in their specific commitments. The Christian framework articulates the experience of separation as a consequence of the fall, a theological claim about the human condition and its disruption and restoration. The physical framework articulates the apparent separateness of the macroscopic world as an emergent consequence of decoherence, a specific physical account. The relationship between them requires careful examination, and any bridge between them is speculative and should be marked clearly as such. The Christian framework nonetheless articulates a recognition that bears profoundly on the experience of loneliness, the recognition that the experience of separation is not the deepest truth about the human being who was created for communion, and whose deepest hope is the restoration of the communion that the experience of separation obscures. The question of the relationship between the apparent separateness of the self and the deeper interconnectedness that both the physics and the contemplative traditions have been uncovering bears careful articulation. The physical understanding of decoherence establishes that the apparent separateness of the macroscopic world is an emergent consequence of the interaction of quantum systems with their environment, and that the deeper quantum interconnectedness is not eliminated but is hidden by this process. The contemplative traditions articulate that the experience of the self as fundamentally separate is in some sense a surface appearance, and that beneath the apparent separation there is a deeper interconnectedness or unity that the contemplative practice may reveal. The convergence between these recognitions is striking, with both the physics and the contemplative traditions articulating a deeper interconnectedness beneath the apparent separateness of ordinary experience. The relationship between them, however, requires careful examination, rather than easy conflation. The physical understanding of decoherence concerns the behavior of quantum systems and their interaction with the environment, and it does not directly concern the experience of the self or the question of human connection. The decoherence of a dust particle has no evident bearing on whether the human being is, at the deepest level, connected to others. The contemplative recognition concerns the nature of the self and its relationship to the deeper reality, and it is a claim of a different kind than the physical account, a claim about the structure of experience and the nature of the self, rather than about the behavior of physical systems. The relationship between the physical account of why the macroscopic world appears separate and the contemplative recognition of the deeper interconnectedness of the self is a matter for careful reflection, and any bridge between them is speculative and should be marked clearly as such. What the convergence suggests is not that the physics proves the contemplative recognition, or that the contemplative recognition is validated by the physics, but that both the physics and the contemplative traditions, through their very different methods, have arrived at the recognition that the apparent separateness of ordinary experience is not the deepest truth about reality, and that beneath the apparent separateness, there is a deeper interconnectedness that the ordinary experience obscures. This recognition, arrived at through such different methods, is genuinely striking, and it bears consideration in any honest engagement with the question of separateness and connection that lies at the heart of the experience of loneliness. The recognition does not eliminate the experience of loneliness, nor does it dismiss the reality of the suffering that loneliness causes. The feeling of separateness is real, and it is not made less real by the recognition that the apparent separateness of the world is, at the deepest level, an emergent appearance rather than a fundamental feature of reality. What the recognition offers is not the dismissal of the experience of separateness, but a different perspective on what the experience of separateness ultimately means, a perspective that both the physics and the contemplative traditions have, through their different methods, been uncovering. The popular discussions of decoherence and the measurement problem have often distorted what the physics actually shows. The popular framework that holds that the physics establishes that the separate self is an illusion in a manner that validates specific contemplative claims, or that the physics establishes that consciousness creates reality, or that the observer is connected to all things through quantum processes, draws specific implications from the physics that the physics itself does not support. The legitimate physics establishes that the apparent separateness of the macroscopic world is an emergent consequence of decoherence, and that the deeper quantum interconnectedness is hidden rather than eliminated by this process. The physics does not establish that the experience of the self as separate is an illusion in the sense that the contemplative traditions intend, or that consciousness creates reality, or that the human being is connected to all things through quantum processes in a manner that would explain or eliminate the experience of loneliness. The popular framework that conflates the legitimate physics with these broader claims does not survive careful examination. The framework has been criticized by serious physicists, including Sean Carroll at Johns Hopkins University, who has written extensively on the proper interpretation of quantum mechanics and on the various ways in which the popular treatments distort what the physics actually establishes, and by various philosophers of physics who have articulated the limits of what the physics can establish about the nature of the self and consciousness. The careful position is to engage with what the physics actually establishes about decoherence and the emergent nature of macroscopic separateness, while engaging the broader questions about the self and connection through whatever philosophical and contemplative resources may be relevant. The convergence between the physical understanding and the contemplative recognition is genuinely striking, and it bears careful consideration, but the relationship between them is a matter for careful reflection rather than easy conflation, and any bridge between them is speculative and should be marked clearly as such. The investigation will continue in the subsequent stages, with examination of how the great philosophical and contemplative traditions have understood the relationship between solitude and connection, and how the practices that the traditions have developed may bear on the experience of loneliness and the recognition of the deeper interconnectedness that lies beneath the apparent separation. The next stages will examine the specific frameworks that the Western and Eastern traditions have developed for understanding solitude and connection, with attention to the genuine differences between the frameworks as well as to the structural convergences that they share with the contemporary scientific understanding. The question of why the deeply interconnected reality gives rise to the experience of separateness is one that both the physics and the contemplative traditions have examined, and the convergence between their recognitions, while requiring careful examination, is genuinely striking. The experience of loneliness, real and painful as it is, arises within a self that experiences itself as fundamentally separate. Whether this experience of separateness is the deepest truth about the self, or whether beneath the apparent separateness there is a deeper interconnectedness that the contemplative practice may reveal, is a question that bears profoundly on the experience of loneliness, and it is a question that the investigation will continue to examine with the care that the question deserves. The investigation continues. There is a form of aloneness that the human being has sought rather than fled. This is one of the more striking facts about the human relationship to solitude, and it stands in apparent contradiction to everything that the science of loneliness has established about the human need for connection and the suffering that isolation produces. The science of loneliness has established that the human being is a fundamentally social being, that the need for connection is as deep as the need for food and water, and that the suffering of isolation can be as harmful to health as the major recognized risk factors for illness and early death. And yet, across the history of the Western contemplative traditions, the human being has again and again sought out solitude, withdrawing from the company of others into the silence of the desert, the cell, or the hermitage, in the conviction that this chosen aloneness was not a deprivation, but a path to the deepest connection of all. The figures who undertook this withdrawal were not fleeing from connection but seeking it, in the conviction that the deepest connection that the human being can attain is a connection that the distractions of ordinary social life impede rather than provide, a connection with the divine reality that the silence of solitude opens. The apparent contradiction between the human need for connection and the contemplative pursuit of solitude dissolves when the distinction is drawn between the suffering of loneliness and the chosen solitude of the contemplative. The suffering of loneliness is the painful experience of the absence of a connection that the human being needs and desires, an experience that the human being does not choose and from which the human being seeks relief. The chosen solitude of the contemplative is the deliberate withdrawal from the company of others for the sake of a connection deeper than the ordinary social world provides, a withdrawal undertaken not in flight from connection, but in pursuit of it. The contemplative who withdraws into solitude does not cease to desire connection, but seeks a connection of a different and deeper kind, a connection with the divine reality that the contemplative tradition holds to be the deepest fulfillment of the human longing for communion. This stage of the investigation will examine the frameworks that the Western contemplative traditions developed for understanding this chosen solitude, the solitude that is sought rather than suffered, and the relationship between this chosen solitude and the deeper connection that the traditions held it to provide. The examination will attend to the genuine differences between the various frameworks as well as to the structural patterns that they share, and it will attend always to the distinction between the chosen solitude that the traditions sought and the suffering of loneliness that the science of loneliness has examined. The chosen solitude of the contemplative is not the suffering of loneliness, and the frameworks that the traditions developed for understanding the chosen solitude do not dismiss or diminish the reality of the suffering that loneliness causes. The frameworks rather suggest that the relationship between aloneness and connection is more complex than the ordinary understanding assumes, and that the human being may, through certain practices and orientations, find in aloneness not the suffering of loneliness, but the deepest connection of all. The Christian tradition developed the most extensive of the Western frameworks for understanding the chosen solitude through the tradition of the desert fathers and mothers that emerged in the deserts of Egypt and Syria in the 3rd and 4th centuries. The tradition began with the figure of Anthony the Great, who was born in Egypt around the middle of the 3rd century, and who, upon hearing the gospel injunction to sell all that he had and follow Christ, withdrew into the Egyptian desert to pursue a life of prayer and asceticism. Anthony's withdrawal, which is recorded in the biography written by Athanasius of Alexandria around the middle of the 4th century, became one of the foundational narratives of the Christian monastic tradition, the model of the withdrawal into solitude for the sake of the deeper connection with God. The biography records Anthony's years of solitary struggle in the desert, his confrontation with the temptations and the demons that he encountered in his solitude, and his eventual emergence as a figure of profound spiritual authority to whom others came for guidance. The biography records that Anthony withdrew progressively deeper into the desert across the decades of his life, first to the edge of his village, then to the tombs beyond it, then to an abandoned fortress in the desert, and finally to a remote mountain near the Red Sea, each withdrawal taking him further from the company of others and deeper into the solitude in which he pursued the connection with God. The narrative articulates the framework that the withdrawal into solitude was not a withdrawal from the spiritual struggle, but an entry into its most intense form, a confrontation with the deepest realities of the self and of the relationship between the self and God, that the distractions of ordinary social life had obscured. Anthony's confrontation with the demons in the desert, which the biography records in vivid detail, articulates the framework that the solitude was not an escape from struggle, but the arena of the most intense struggle, the place where the deepest realities of the self were confronted without the distractions that ordinary life provides. The biography records that Anthony emerged from his solitary struggle not diminished but transformed, with a serenity and a spiritual authority that drew others to him, so that the solitary who had withdrawn from the company of others became, paradoxically, a figure of profound connection, a spiritual father to whom countless others came for guidance. The paradox articulates the framework that the deepest connection with others may be attained through the solitude in which the connection with God is deepened, that the one who has been transformed in solitude returns to the human community with a capacity for connection deeper than the one with which they withdrew. The tradition that Anthony inaugurated spread across the deserts of Egypt and Syria, with countless men and women withdrawing into solitude to pursue the contemplative life, some living as solitary hermits, and others gathering into the loose communities that would eventually develop into the monastic orders. The sayings and the wisdom of these desert ascetics were collected in the texts known as the Apophthegmata Patrum, the sayings of the desert fathers, which preserve the accumulated wisdom of the tradition on the relationship between solitude and the spiritual life. The sayings articulate again and again the framework that the solitude of the desert was a path to a connection deeper than any that the ordinary social world could provide, a connection with God that the silence and the stillness of the desert opened. The desert ascetics understood their solitude not as isolation but as a form of communion, a withdrawal from the distractions of ordinary social life that opened the way to a deeper communion with the divine reality that underlies all things. The framework that the desert tradition developed for understanding the chosen solitude bears careful articulation, since it stands in apparent contradiction to the science of loneliness, and yet articulates a recognition that the science does not contradict. The desert ascetics did not deny the human need for connection that the science of loneliness has established. They sought, rather, a connection of a different kind, a connection with the divine reality that they held to be the deepest connection that the human being can attain. The framework holds that the human being is created for communion with God, that this communion is the deepest fulfillment of the human being, and that the distractions of ordinary social life can impede this communion by occupying the attention and the desire of the human being with lesser things. The withdrawal into solitude, on this framework, is not a withdrawal from connection but a removal of the distractions that impede the deepest connection, a clearing of the space in which the communion with God can deepen. The framework does not hold that the human being should live in permanent isolation from other human beings, and indeed the desert tradition developed an extensive understanding of the community of the solitaries, the loose communities in which the hermits supported one another in their solitary pursuit. The framework holds rather that a period of withdrawal into solitude, undertaken for the sake of the deeper connection with God, can be a path to a fulfillment that the ordinary social world cannot provide, and that the human being who has deepened the connection with God in solitude returns to the human community with a capacity for connection deeper than the one with which they withdrew. The framework articulates a recognition that the deepest human longing is for a connection that no merely human connection can fully satisfy, a longing that the desert ascetic sought to fulfill through the communion with God that the solitude opened. The framework that the desert tradition developed was elaborated and deepened across the subsequent Christian monastic and contemplative tradition. The tradition of monasticism that developed from the desert origins articulated an extensive framework for the contemplative life, with the various monastic orders developing the structures and the practices through which the contemplative pursuit could be sustained across a lifetime. The Rule of Saint Benedict, composed in the 6th century, articulated the framework for the communal monastic life that would become the foundation of Western monasticism, balancing the solitude of individual prayer with the communion of the monastic community in a structure designed to sustain the contemplative pursuit. Benedict, who founded the monastery of Monte Cassino in Italy in the 6th century, articulated a rule for the monastic life that balanced the various dimensions of the contemplative pursuit, the solitude of individual prayer, the communion of the community, the labor of the hands, and the study of the sacred texts, in a structure designed to sustain the contemplative pursuit across a lifetime. The Benedictine framework recognized that the human being who pursues the contemplative life requires both solitude and community, both the solitary prayer in which the connection with God deepens and the communion of the community in which the contemplative is supported and held. The framework articulated a distinctive understanding of the relationship between solitude and community, holding the two together in a balance that recognized the human need for both, the solitude in which the connection with God deepens, and the community in which the human need for connection with others is met. The framework bears consideration alongside the science of loneliness and its recognition of the human need for connection, with the Benedictine framework recognizing that the contemplative pursuit, even as it involves the solitude of individual prayer, must be sustained within a community that meets the human need for connection. The framework articulates a recognition that the chosen solitude of the contemplative is not the same as isolation from all human connection, that the contemplative, who withdraws into solitude for the sake of the connection with God, may yet require the communion of a community that supports the contemplative pursuit and meets the human need for connection with others. The tradition of hesychasm in the Eastern Orthodox Church developed the framework for the contemplative practice through which the solitary monk could attain the direct experience of the divine. The term hesychasm derives from the Greek word hesychia, meaning stillness or silence, and it refers to the tradition of contemplative prayer through which the monk seeks the stillness in which the experience of God becomes possible. The tradition was developed across the centuries of the Byzantine monastic tradition, with the monks of Mount Athos, the monastic peninsula in Greece that has remained a center of Orthodox monasticism for more than 1,000 years, developing the practices of the hesychast tradition to a high degree of refinement. The hesychast practice centered on the continuous repetition of the Jesus prayer, the brief invocation of the name of Christ that the monk repeated continuously, coordinating the prayer with the rhythm of the breath in a practice designed to bring the mind into the stillness in which the experience of God becomes possible. The practice was understood to draw the mind from its ordinary scattered state into a unified stillness, a stillness in which the distractions of the ordinary world fall away and the experience of the divine presence becomes possible. The tradition was articulated most fully by Gregory Palamas, the 14th century theologian and Archbishop of Thessalonica, who defended the hesychast practices against their critics and articulated the theological framework that underlay them. Palamas articulated the framework that the hesychast monk, through the practice of contemplative prayer, could attain the direct experience of the divine light, the uncreated light that the disciples had seen at the transfiguration of Christ on Mount Tabor, a direct experience of the divine reality that represented the deepest possible connection. Palamas defended the framework against the critic Balaam of Calabria, who had argued that the direct experience of God was impossible, articulating the distinction between the unknowable essence of God and the divine energies through which God may be directly experienced, a distinction that became central to the Orthodox theological tradition. The framework held that this direct experience of the divine was attained through the stillness and the solitude of the contemplative practice, the withdrawal from the distractions of ordinary life into the silence in which the experience of God becomes possible. The hesychasts tradition articulated the most refined of the Christian frameworks for the connection with the divine that the chosen solitude opens, a connection so direct and so profound that it represented, on the framework, the deepest fulfillment of the human longing for communion. The Christian contemplative tradition continued to develop the framework for the chosen solitude across the subsequent centuries, with the various contemplative figures and movements articulating the relationship between solitude and the deepest connection. The mystical tradition of the Christian West, articulated by figures including Meister Eckhart in the 13th and 14th centuries and John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila in the 16th century, developed the framework for the contemplative ascent to union with God, the deepest connection that the human being can attain. John of the Cross, the Spanish mystic and Carmelite friar, articulated the framework through his account of the dark night of the soul, the painful process of purification through which the soul is prepared for the union with God. John of the Cross, who lived in the 16th century and who worked alongside Teresa of Avila in the reform of the Carmelite order, articulated the framework in his poems and their accompanying commentaries, including the work known as The Dark Night, which describes the soul's journey through the darkness toward the union with God. The framework distinguished between the night of the senses, in which the soul is purified of its attachment to the consolations of the senses, and the night of the spirit, in which the soul is purified of its deeper attachments in preparation for the union with God. The framework articulated the paradox that the deepest connection is attained through a process that involves a profound experience of darkness and apparent abandonment, a stripping away of all the lesser attachments that impede the union with God. The framework articulated a recognition that the path to the deepest connection may pass through an experience that resembles the deepest loneliness, the experience of the dark night in which the soul feels abandoned even by God, an experience that the framework held to be not the absence of God, but the purifying presence of a God, too close and too overwhelming to be experienced as presence. The framework bears consideration alongside the experience of loneliness, with the recognition that the experience of apparent abandonment may, on the contemplative framework, be a stage in the deepening of the connection rather than its absence. The framework does not suggest that the suffering of loneliness is to be sought, or that the experience of abandonment is to be welcomed for its own sake. The framework suggests rather that the relationship between the experience of apparent abandonment and the deepest connection is more complex than the ordinary understanding assumes, and that the experience that resembles the deepest loneliness may, in the context of the contemplative pursuit, be a stage in the deepening of the connection that the soul seeks. The Greek philosophical tradition developed its own frameworks for understanding the relationship between solitude and the deepest reality, frameworks that influenced the Christian contemplative tradition and that articulated their own distinctive understanding of the contemplative pursuit. The philosophical tradition of Platonism articulated the framework for the ascent of the soul to the contemplation of the eternal forms, the ascent through which the soul turns from the changing world of the senses to the contemplation of the unchanging reality that underlies it. The framework was developed most fully in the tradition of Neoplatonism, articulated by the philosopher Plotinus in the 3rd century, whose work the Enneads articulated the framework for the ascent of the soul to union with the One, the ultimate reality that is the source of all things. Plotinus, who taught in Rome in the 3rd century, and whose teachings were collected by his student Porphyry in the work known as the Enneads, articulated a comprehensive framework for the structure of reality and the ascent of the soul to its source. The framework held that all things proceed from the One, the ultimate reality that is beyond all description and all multiplicity, through a series of emanations that give rise to the multiplicity of the world. The framework held that the soul, having descended from its source into the world of multiplicity, could ascend back toward its source through the contemplative pursuit, turning from the world of the senses to the contemplation of the higher realities, and finally to the union with the One that is its deepest fulfillment. Plotinus articulated the framework that the soul, through the contemplative ascent, could attain a union with the One that represented the deepest fulfillment of the soul, a union that Plotinus described through his famous account of the flight of the alone to the alone. The phrase, which concludes the Enneads, articulates the framework that the deepest union is attained in a solitude that transcends the ordinary social world, a solitude in which the soul, having withdrawn from all the distractions of the lower world, attains the union with the ultimate reality that is its deepest fulfillment. The phrase articulates a profound recognition about the relationship between solitude and the deepest connection, the recognition that the deepest union is attained not in the company of others, but in a solitude that transcends the ordinary social world, a solitude in which the soul is alone with the ultimate reality that is the source of all things. Porphyry recorded that Plotinus himself attained this union with the One several times during the years that Porphyry was with him, a union that Plotinus held to be the deepest fulfillment of the philosophical life. The framework bears striking relationship to the Christian contemplative frameworks, which were substantially influenced by the Neoplatonic tradition, and it articulates a distinctively philosophical understanding of the relationship between solitude and the deepest connection. The frameworks differ substantially in their specific commitments. The Neoplatonic framework articulates the ascent to union with the impersonal One, the ultimate reality that is the source of all things, a reality beyond all description and all personality. The Christian framework articulates the union with the personal God, a communion of love between the human being and the God who is himself a communion of persons. The differences are genuine and significant, and they reflect the genuine differences between the philosophical and the theological frameworks, between the impersonal, ultimate reality of the Neoplatonic tradition and the personal God of the Christian tradition. The frameworks nonetheless share the recognition that the deepest connection is attained through a contemplative pursuit that involves a withdrawal into a solitude that transcends the ordinary social world. The Jewish tradition developed its own distinctive frameworks for understanding the relationship between solitude and the connection with God, frameworks that articulated the Jewish understanding of the relationship between the human being and the God of Israel. The Hebrew scriptures record the various figures who encountered God in solitude, from Moses on the mountain to Elijah in the cave, articulating the framework that the encounter with God may occur in a solitude that withdraws from the ordinary social world. The narrative of Elijah at Mount Horeb, recorded in the first book of Kings, articulates the framework through the account of Elijah's encounter with God, who was found not in the wind, the earthquake, or the fire, but in the still small voice, the sound of sheer silence that Elijah encountered in the solitude of the cave. The narrative records that Elijah, fleeing from those who sought his life, came to Mount Horeb and took shelter in a cave, and that the word of God came to him there, not in the dramatic manifestations of the wind that broke the rocks, the earthquake that shook the mountain, or the fire, but in the still small voice, the sound of sheer silence that came after them. The narrative articulates the framework that the encounter with God may occur in the stillness and the silence of solitude, a recognition that bears relationship to the Christian hesychast tradition, with its emphasis on the stillness in which the experience of God becomes possible. The narrative articulates as well the recognition that the encounter with God in solitude may come in the midst of the deepest distress, that Elijah encountered God in the silence of the cave at a moment when he had fled in fear and despair, a recognition that bears on the relationship between the experience of distress and the encounter with the divine in solitude. The Jewish mystical tradition, articulated in the Kabbalah, developed an elaborate framework for the contemplative ascent to the connection with the divine, with the various practices of contemplative meditation through which the practitioner could ascend toward the connection with the deeper reality. The Jewish tradition maintained, alongside its frameworks for the solitary encounter with God, a strong emphasis on the communal dimension of the relationship with God, the covenant between God and the people of Israel that is fulfilled in the life of the community. The framework articulates a recognition that bears on the question of the relationship between solitude and connection, with the Jewish tradition holding together the solitary encounter with God and the communal life of the covenant in a manner that articulates the relationship between the individual and the community in the relationship with the divine. The Jewish framework places a particular emphasis on the communal dimension, holding that the relationship with God is fulfilled not only in the solitary encounter, but in the life of the community that lives in covenant with God, a recognition that bears on the human need for connection that the science of loneliness has established. The frameworks differ from the Christian and the Neoplatonic frameworks in their specific commitments, reflecting the genuine differences between the traditions, and they articulate a distinctively Jewish understanding of the relationship between solitude and the connection with the God of Israel. The frameworks that the Western traditions developed for understanding the chosen solitude bear consideration alongside the experience of loneliness that the science of loneliness has examined. The frameworks do not deny the human need for connection that the science has established, and they do not dismiss the reality of the suffering that loneliness causes. The frameworks rather articulate the recognition that the deepest human longing is for a connection that no merely human connection can fully satisfy, a connection with the divine reality that the contemplative pursuit seeks, and that the chosen solitude of the contemplative may be a path to this deepest connection rather than a deprivation of connection. The distinction between the chosen solitude of the contemplative and the suffering of loneliness bears emphasis, since the two are easily confused and yet are profoundly different. The chosen solitude of the contemplative is undertaken for the sake of the deeper connection that it opens, embraced as a path to the deepest fulfillment of the human longing for communion. The suffering of loneliness is the painful experience of the absence of the connection that the human being needs, an experience that the contemplative frameworks do not dismiss or diminish. The relationship between the two is complex, since the chosen solitude may at times involve an experience that resembles the suffering of loneliness, as the account of the dark night of the soul articulates, and yet the chosen solitude is distinguished from the suffering of loneliness by its orientation toward the deeper connection that it seeks. The frameworks suggest that the human being who suffers from loneliness may find, in the wisdom of the contemplative traditions, resources for understanding the relationship between aloneness and connection, and for transforming, where possible, the experience of aloneness from the suffering of loneliness into the chosen solitude that opens the way to the deepest connection. The frameworks do not suggest that this transformation is easy, or that the suffering of loneliness can simply be willed away, or that the person who suffers from loneliness is somehow failing to undertake the transformation that the contemplative traditions describe. The frameworks suggest rather that the accumulated wisdom of the contemplative traditions, developed across millennia of reflection on the relationship between solitude and connection, may offer resources for understanding the experience of aloneness and for finding within it the possibility of a connection deeper than the one whose absence the loneliness signals. The investigation will continue in the next stage with examination of the frameworks that the Eastern contemplative traditions developed for understanding the relationship between solitude and connection, the frameworks of the Hindu, Buddhist and Daoist traditions that articulate their own distinctive understanding of the chosen solitude and the deeper connection that it opens. The frameworks of the Eastern traditions bear striking relationship to the frameworks of the Western traditions that this stage has examined, even as they differ substantially in their specific commitments, and the examination of both will contribute to the broader understanding of the relationship between aloneness and connection that lies at the heart of the experience of loneliness. The chosen solitude that the contemplative traditions sought was not the suffering of loneliness, but a path to the deepest connection, and the frameworks that the traditions developed for understanding it bear consideration, alongside the science of loneliness and the deeper interconnectedness that both the physics and the contemplative traditions have been uncovering. The experience of loneliness, real and painful as it is, exists in a complex relationship with the chosen solitude that the contemplative traditions sought, a relationship that bears on the question of whether the aloneness that the human being experiences is the suffering of loneliness or the path to the deepest connection. The investigation continues. The traditions of the East develop their own profound understanding of the solitude that opens the way to the deepest connection, an understanding that arose independently of the Western traditions and that articulates its own distinctive frameworks for the relationship between aloneness and the deepest reality. The contemplative traditions of India and China developed, across millennia of reflection, frameworks for understanding the chosen solitude that bear striking relationship to the Western frameworks, even as they differ substantially in their specific commitments. The independence of the development is itself striking, since the traditions of the East developed their frameworks for understanding the chosen solitude without contact with the Western traditions, arriving through their own distinctive paths at the recognition that the deepest realization is attained through a withdrawal from the distractions of the social world into the solitude of the contemplative pursuit. The figures of these traditions, like the desert ascetics and the contemplatives of the West, withdrew again and again into solitude in the conviction that the chosen aloneness was not a deprivation but a path to the deepest realization, the recognition of the ultimate reality that the distractions of ordinary social life impede. The forest hermits of the Hindu tradition, the wandering ascetics of the Buddhist tradition, and the mountain recluses of the Daoist tradition all sought a solitude that they held to be a path to the deepest realization, the recognition of the ultimate truth that the contemplative pursuit seeks. The recurrence of the figure of the contemplative who withdraws into solitude, across traditions that developed independently of one another, is one of the more striking patterns in the history of human spirituality, a pattern that suggests that the recognition of the relationship between solitude and the deepest realization is one that the human contemplative pursuit has arrived at again and again, through the most various paths. This stage of the investigation will examine the frameworks that the Eastern traditions developed for understanding this chosen solitude, with attention to the genuine differences between the traditions as well as to the structural patterns that they share, both with one another and with the Western traditions that the previous stage examined. The examination will attend, as the previous stage did, to the distinction between the chosen solitude that the traditions sought and the suffering of loneliness that the science of loneliness has examined. The chosen solitude of the Eastern contemplative, like that of the Western contemplative, is not the suffering of loneliness, and the frameworks that the Eastern traditions developed do not dismiss or diminish the reality of the suffering that loneliness causes. The frameworks rather articulate, through their own distinctive understanding, the recognition that the relationship between aloneness and the deepest realization is more complex than the ordinary understanding assumes, and that the human being may, through the contemplative pursuit, find in solitude not the suffering of loneliness, but the path to the deepest realization. The Hindu tradition developed an extensive framework for understanding the chosen solitude through its understanding of the renunciation that the deepest pursuit of the ultimate reality requires. The framework of the 4 stages of life, the 4 ashramas, articulated a progression from the stage of the student through the stage of the householder to the stage of the forest dweller, and finally the stage of the renunciate, with the later stages involving a progressive withdrawal from social engagement toward the deepest pursuit of the ultimate reality. The stage of the renunciate, the sannyasa, represented the complete renunciation of the social world for the sake of the pursuit of liberation, the moksha that releases the self from the cycle of rebirth and unites it with the ultimate reality. The renunciate, the sannyasin, withdrew entirely from the social world, abandoning all possessions and all social ties to pursue the realization of the ultimate reality in complete solitude. The renunciation involved a ritual death to the social world, with the renunciate performing his own funeral rites to mark the complete severance of the social ties that had bound him to the world of the householder, a severance so complete that the renunciate was understood to have died to the social world and to have been reborn into the pursuit of liberation. The framework held that this complete renunciation was not a deprivation but the deepest fulfillment, the release from all the attachments that bind the self to the cycle of rebirth, and the realization of the identity between the individual self and the ultimate reality. The framework articulated the recognition that the deepest realization requires a withdrawal from the social world that is more complete than any that the other stages of life permit, a withdrawal into the solitude in which the realization of the ultimate reality becomes possible. The framework recognized that the renunciation was appropriate to the later stages of life, after the human being had fulfilled the obligations of the earlier stages, the stage of the student in which the human being learns, and the stage of the householder in which the human being raises a family and contributes to the social world. The framework articulated a progression through which the human being first fulfills the social obligations that the earlier stages involve and then, in the later stages, turns toward the deepest pursuit of the ultimate reality, a pursuit that the complete renunciation of the social world makes possible. The Hindu tradition developed an extensive understanding of the practices through which the renunciate pursued the realization, the practices of meditation and contemplation, through which the renunciate sought to still the activity of the mind and to realize the identity between the individual self and the ultimate reality. The framework articulated the recognition that the deepest realization is attained not in the company of others, but in the solitude in which the renunciate, having withdrawn from all the distractions of the social world, pursues the realization of the ultimate reality that is the deepest fulfillment of the self. The Hindu tradition articulated the discernment that the contemplative pursuit requires through the concept of viveka, the discrimination between the eternal and the non-eternal, between the real and the unreal, that the pursuit of liberation requires. The framework held that the contemplative must learn to discriminate between the eternal reality of the self and the changing world of appearances, to recognize the ultimate reality that underlies the changing world, and to turn from the changing world toward the realization of the ultimate reality. The framework articulated the recognition that this discrimination requires a withdrawal from the absorption in the changing world that ordinary life involves, a turning of the attention from the external world toward the inner reality that the contemplative pursuit seeks. The framework was developed in the various schools of Hindu philosophy, with the Advaita Vedanta tradition of Shankara articulating the framework most fully through its understanding of the realization of the identity between the individual self, the Atman, and the ultimate reality, the Brahman. The framework held that the deepest realization is the recognition of this identity, the recognition that the individual self is not separate from the ultimate reality, but is identical with it, a recognition that releases the self from the bondage to the apparent separateness and unites it with the ultimate reality that is its true nature. The framework bears profoundly on the question of solitude and connection, since it articulates the recognition that the deepest realization is the recognition of the identity between the self and the ultimate reality, a recognition in which the apparent separateness of the self is transcended in the realization of the deeper unity. The modern Hindu sage Ramana Maharshi, who lived in the late 19th and the 20th centuries, and who spent many years in solitude on the sacred mountain of Arunachala in southern India, articulated this framework through his teaching of self-inquiry, the practice of inquiring into the nature of the self through the question of "Who am I?", a practice through which the contemplative seeks to realize the ultimate reality that is the true nature of the self. Ramana Maharshi, who as a young man underwent a spontaneous experience of the realization of the self, and who subsequently withdrew to the mountain of Arunachala, where he remained for the rest of his life, spent his early years there in profound silence and solitude, absorbed in the realization of the ultimate reality. The accounts record that he spent long periods in such deep absorption that he neglected even the care of his body, so complete was his absorption in the realization of the self. He later emerged to teach, and people came from across India and eventually from across the world to be in his presence and to receive his teaching, so that the sage who had withdrawn into the deepest solitude became, like the desert ascetics of the Christian tradition, a figure of profound connection to whom countless others came for guidance. Ramana Maharshi articulated the framework that the deepest realization is attained through the inquiry into the nature of the self, an inquiry that the solitude of the contemplative pursuit makes possible, and that this realization unites the self with the ultimate reality that is its true nature. His teaching of self-inquiry articulated the practice of tracing the sense of the self back to its source, inquiring into the nature of the I that seems to be the center of experience, a practice through which the contemplative seeks to realize that the true nature of the self is not the separate individual self, but the ultimate reality that underlies it. The framework articulated the recognition that the deepest realization, attained through the inquiry into the nature of the self in the solitude of the contemplative pursuit, is the realization of the identity between the self and the ultimate reality, a realization in which the apparent separateness of the individual self is transcended in the recognition of the deeper reality that is its true nature. The Buddhist tradition developed its own distinctive framework for understanding the chosen solitude, a framework that arose from the example of the Buddha himself, and that articulated the Buddhist understanding of the relationship between solitude and the realization of liberation. The Buddha, according to the traditional accounts, attained his enlightenment in solitude, having withdrawn from the world to pursue the realization of the truth that would release beings from suffering, and having attained the enlightenment beneath the Bodhi tree after a long period of solitary contemplation. The traditional accounts record that the Buddha, born a prince and raised in the luxury of the palace, left the palace and the social world to pursue the realization of the truth, withdrawing into the solitude of the forest to pursue the contemplative practices through which he sought the release from suffering. The accounts record that the Buddha pursued the various contemplative practices of his time, including the extreme ascetic practices that he eventually abandoned as unhelpful, before attaining the enlightenment through the meditation beneath the Bodhi tree, the realization of the truth that would become the foundation of the Buddhist tradition. The example of the Buddha established the model of the withdrawal into solitude for the sake of the realization of liberation, a model that the Buddhist tradition developed across the subsequent millennia. The Buddhist tradition developed the framework of viveka, which in the Buddhist context refers to seclusion or solitude, the withdrawal from the distractions of the social world that the pursuit of liberation requires. The framework held that the pursuit of liberation requires a withdrawal into solitude, a seclusion from the distractions of the social world that allows the contemplative to pursue the meditation and the contemplation through which liberation is realized. The Buddha himself was recorded as encouraging his followers to seek out secluded places, the foot of a tree, an empty hut, a quiet forest, in which to pursue the meditation through which liberation is realized. articulating the framework that the solitude of such places is conducive to the contemplative pursuit. The Buddhist tradition developed the forest tradition, the tradition of the monks who withdrew into the forests to pursue the contemplative life in solitude, a tradition that has continued across the Buddhist world to the present day. The forest monks withdrew from the monasteries and the towns into the solitude of the forest, pursuing the meditation and the contemplation through which they sought the realization of liberation, living simply in the forest in a manner that minimized the distractions of the social world and maximized the opportunity for the contemplative pursuit. The framework articulated the recognition that the deepest realization is attained in the solitude of the contemplative pursuit, the seclusion from the distractions of the social world that allows the contemplative to pursue the realization of liberation. The Buddhist framework for the chosen solitude differs profoundly from the Hindu framework in its understanding of what the deepest realization involves, a difference that reflects the genuine and profound difference between the two traditions on the nature of the self. The Hindu framework holds that the deepest realization is the recognition of the identity between the individual self, the Atman, and the ultimate reality, the Brahman, the recognition of the eternal self that underlies the changing world of appearances. The Buddhist framework holds, by contrast, that there is no permanent self to be realized, that the deepest realization is the recognition of the absence of any permanent self, the anatta that the Buddha taught against the Hindu doctrine of the eternal Atman. The difference is genuine and profound, one of the most significant philosophical disagreements in the history of human thought, and it bears directly on the understanding of the relationship between solitude and the deepest realization. For the Hindu tradition, the deepest realization attained in solitude is the recognition of the eternal self that is identical with the ultimate reality. For the Buddhist tradition, the deepest realization attained in solitude is the recognition of the absence of any permanent self, the recognition that releases the contemplative from the attachment to the constructed sense of a separate self. The two frameworks cannot both be correct, since they make opposite claims about the existence of the permanent self, and the difference between them cannot be dissolved by treating the two frameworks as merely different ways of saying the same thing. The difference bears on the understanding of the relationship between solitude and connection, since the Hindu framework articulates the deepest realization as the recognition of the identity between the self and the ultimate reality, while the Buddhist framework articulates the deepest realization as the recognition of the absence of any permanent self that could be separate from others in the first place. Both frameworks articulate, through their genuinely different understandings, the recognition that the apparent separateness of the self is not the deepest truth, but they articulate this recognition through frameworks that differ profoundly in their understanding of what the deepest truth is. The Buddhist tradition developed the understanding that the recognition of the absence of any permanent self is the foundation of the deepest connection with others, a connection expressed through the cultivation of compassion and loving kindness. The framework held that the recognition of the absence of any permanent self releases the contemplative from the self-centered attachment that the illusion of a separate self produces, opening the way to a compassion for all beings that the attachment to the separate self had impeded. The Buddhist tradition developed the practices of the cultivation of loving kindness, the metta that extends benevolence to all beings, and of compassion, the karuna that responds to the suffering of all beings, practices through which the contemplative cultivates the connection with all beings that the recognition of the absence of the separate self makes possible. The practice of the cultivation of loving kindness, the metta bhavana, involves the systematic extension of benevolence, beginning with oneself and extending progressively to those one loves, to those one is neutral toward, to those one finds difficult, and finally to all beings without exception, a practice through which the contemplative cultivates a benevolence that extends to all beings, without the limits that the attachment to the separate self imposes. The framework articulated the recognition that the deepest connection with others is attained not through the assertion of the separate self, but through the recognition of its absence, the recognition that releases the contemplative from the self-centered attachment and opens the way to the compassion for all beings. The framework bears profoundly on the question of solitude and connection, since it articulates the recognition that the solitude of the contemplative pursuit, far from isolating the contemplative from others, opens the way to the deepest connection with all beings, the compassion that the recognition of the absence of the separate self makes possible. The framework articulates the paradox that the deepest connection with others is attained through the solitude in which the contemplative realizes the absence of the separate self, a solitude that opens the way to the compassion for all beings that the attachment to the separate self had impeded. The recognition bears striking relationship to the Christian recognition, examined in the previous stage, that the contemplative who has been transformed in solitude returns to the human community with a capacity for connection deeper than the one with which they withdrew. The recognition that the chosen solitude, far from isolating the contemplative from others, may open the way to a deeper connection with all beings. The two traditions articulate this recognition through frameworks that differ profoundly in their specific commitments. The Buddhist framework of the compassion that flows from the recognition of the absence of the separate self, and the Christian framework of the love that flows from the union with the God who is love. But they share the recognition that the deepest connection with others may be opened by the solitude of the contemplative pursuit, rather than impeded by it. The Daoist tradition developed its own distinctive framework for understanding the chosen solitude, a framework that articulated the Daoist understanding of the relationship between solitude and the harmony with the Tao that organizes all things. The Daoist tradition held the figure of the hermit sage as a recurring ideal, the sage who withdraws into the mountains to cultivate the harmony with the Tao that the distractions of the social world impede. The framework held that the deepest realization is the harmony with the Tao, the ineffable source and pattern of all things, a harmony that the contemplative attains through the cultivation of the stillness and the spontaneity that align the self with the patterns of the Tao. The Daoist text, the Zhuangzi, attributed to the philosopher Zhuangzi, who lived in the 4th century before the Common Era, articulated the framework through its various stories and reflections on the sage who has attained the harmony with the Tao. The Zhuangzi, one of the foundational texts of the Daoist tradition, alongside the Tao Te Ching attributed to Laozi, articulated its framework through a series of stories, parables, and reflections that articulate the Daoist understanding of the harmony with the Tao and the sage who has attained it. The text articulated the framework through its characteristic combination of philosophical reflection and vivid storytelling, presenting the sage who has attained the harmony with the Tao as one who has transcended the ordinary distinctions and strivings of the social world. The Zhuangzi articulated the framework of Wu Wei, the effortless action that aligns the self with the patterns of the Tao, the action that flows naturally from the harmony with the Tao, rather than from the assertion of the individual will. The framework held that the sage, who has attained the harmony with the Tao, acts not through the assertion of the individual will, but through the effortless action that flows from the alignment with the patterns of the Tao, an action that is in perfect harmony with the natural patterns of things. The Zhuangzi articulated this framework through various images, including the image of the skilled craftsman whose action flows so naturally from his mastery that it requires no conscious effort, the action that has become so aligned with the patterns of things that it flows effortlessly from the harmony with the Tao. The framework articulated the recognition that the deepest realization is attained through a withdrawal from the assertions and the strivings of the social world, a withdrawal into the solitude in which the contemplative cultivates the harmony with the Tao that is the deepest fulfillment. The Daoist tradition held the figure of the mountain recluse as a recurring ideal, the sage who withdraws into the mountains to cultivate the harmony with the Tao, away from the distractions and the strivings of the social world, a figure that became a recurring presence in the Daoist tradition and in the broader culture of China. The Daoist tradition developed the practices through which the contemplative cultivated this harmony, the practices of stillness and meditation through which the contemplative sought to align the self with the patterns of the Tao. The framework articulated the recognition that the deepest realization is the harmony with the Tao, a harmony attained in the solitude of the contemplative pursuit, a solitude in which the contemplative, having withdrawn from the assertions and the strivings of the social world, cultivates the alignment with the patterns of the Tao that organize all things. The frameworks that the Eastern traditions developed for understanding the chosen solitude bear striking relationship to the frameworks of the Western traditions, even as they differ substantially in their specific commitments. Both the Eastern and the Western traditions developed frameworks for understanding the chosen solitude as a path to the deepest realization or connection, the withdrawal from the distractions of the social world that the deepest pursuit requires. Both developed extensive understandings of the practices through which the contemplative pursued the realization in solitude, the meditation and the contemplation through which the deepest realization is sought. Both articulated the recognition that the deepest realization, far from isolating the contemplative from others, may open the way to a deeper connection with all beings, whether the compassion of the Buddhist tradition, the universal love of the Christian tradition, or the harmony with the Tao of the Daoist tradition. The traditions differ substantially in their specific commitments, in their understanding of what the deepest realization involves, and of the nature of the ultimate reality that the contemplative pursuit seeks. The Hindu tradition articulates the realization of the identity between the self and the ultimate reality. The Buddhist tradition articulates the realization of the absence of any permanent self. The Daoist tradition articulates the harmony with the Tao that organizes all things. The Christian tradition articulates the union with the personal God. These are genuinely different understandings of what the deepest realization involves, and the differences between them cannot be dissolved by treating them as merely different ways of saying the same thing. The differences are genuine and profound, and they have been articulated and defended by the traditions themselves across millennia of philosophical and contemplative reflection. The convergence between the traditions is not an agreement on the nature of the deepest realization, on which they differ profoundly, but a convergence on the recognition that the apparent separateness of the self is not the deepest truth, and that the deepest realization, attained through the contemplative pursuit, transcends the apparent separateness in a recognition of a deeper reality, even as the traditions differ profoundly in their understanding of what that deeper reality is. The frameworks of the Eastern and the Western traditions bear consideration alongside the experience of loneliness that the science of loneliness has examined, and alongside the deeper interconnectedness that both the physics and the contemplative traditions have been uncovering. The frameworks do not deny the human need for connection that the science of loneliness has established, and they do not dismiss the reality of the suffering that loneliness causes. The frameworks articulate, through their various and genuinely different understandings, the recognition that the apparent separateness of the self is not the deepest truth, and that the deepest realization, attained through the contemplative pursuit, transcends the apparent separateness in a recognition of a deeper reality. The chosen solitude that the contemplative traditions sought was not the suffering of loneliness, but a path to this deepest realization, the withdrawal from the distractions of the social world that the deepest pursuit requires. The distinction between the chosen solitude of the contemplative and the suffering of loneliness bears emphasis, as it did in the examination of the Western traditions, since the two are easily confused and yet are profoundly different. The chosen solitude of the contemplative is undertaken for the sake of the deepest realization that it opens, embraced as a path to the deepest fulfillment. The suffering of loneliness is the painful experience of the absence of the connection that the human being needs, an experience that the contemplative frameworks do not dismiss or diminish. The frameworks suggest that the human being who suffers from loneliness may find, in the wisdom of the contemplative traditions of both the East and the West, resources for understanding the relationship between aloneness and connection, and for finding, where possible, within the experience of aloneness, the possibility of a deeper realization or connection. The frameworks do not suggest that this is easy, or that the suffering of loneliness can simply be willed away. They suggest rather that the accumulated wisdom of the contemplative traditions, developed across millennia of reflection on the relationship between solitude and the deepest realization, may offer resources for understanding the experience of aloneness and for finding, within it, the possibility of a connection deeper than the one whose absence the loneliness signals. The investigation will continue in the final stage with the synthesis of the various threads that the investigation has examined: the science of loneliness, the deep interconnectedness that the physics has revealed, the understanding of why the interconnected reality gives rise to the experience of separateness, and the frameworks that the contemplative traditions of both the East and the West have developed for understanding the relationship between solitude and the deepest realization or connection. The final stage will draw these threads together into a synthesis that articulates what the convergences between the contemporary science and the contemplative traditions might mean for the experience of loneliness and for the deepest question that the investigation has been pursuing, the question of whether we are, at the deepest level, alone. The experience of loneliness, real and painful as it is, exists in a complex relationship with the deeper interconnectedness that both the physics and the contemplative traditions have been uncovering, and with the chosen solitude that the contemplative traditions sought as a path to the deepest realization. What the convergences between the science and the traditions might mean for the experience of loneliness is the question that the final stage will examine, with the care that the question deserves. The investigation continues. You feel alone, and yet you are reading these words, which someone else has written, across whatever distance of space and time separates the writing from the reading. The fact is worth pausing over, for it contains in miniature the paradox that this entire investigation has been examining. The experience of loneliness is among the most isolating of human experiences, and yet it is shared by nearly every human being who has ever lived, so that the very experience that seems to cut you off from others is in fact one of the deepest things you share with them. The person who feels most profoundly alone is, in this respect, in the company of all of humanity, joined to the countless others who have felt what they feel, across all the centuries of human existence. This investigation began with the recognition of this paradox, the paradox of feeling separate in a universe that, at the deepest level, the contemporary physics has been revealing to be profoundly interconnected. It has examined what the science of loneliness has established about the human need for connection, what the contemporary physics has revealed about the deep interconnectedness of the physical world, why the deeply interconnected reality gives rise to the experience of separateness, and how the great contemplative traditions of both the East and the West have understood the relationship between solitude and the deepest connection. The investigation has held throughout to the recognition that the experience of loneliness is real, that the suffering it causes is real, and that no honest engagement with the experience can begin by dismissing it. It has held as well to the recognition that the relationship between the apparent separateness that the lonely person feels and the deeper interconnectedness that both the physics and the contemplative traditions have been uncovering is a matter for careful reflection rather than easy conflation, and that any bridge between the physical phenomenon and the human experience of connection is speculative and should be marked clearly as such. This final stage will draw these threads together into a synthesis that articulates what the convergences between the contemporary science and the contemplative traditions might mean for the experience of loneliness and for the deepest question that the investigation has been pursuing, the question of whether we are, at the deepest level, alone. The synthesis will not settle the question. The settlement lies beyond what any investigation can provide, and the careful position is to articulate what the convergences make available, rather than to claim definitive answers that the available evidence cannot support. What the synthesis can offer is an articulation of how the contemporary findings and the contemplative frameworks relate to the experience of loneliness that is among the most universal and the most painful of human experiences, and to the question of whether the separateness that the lonely person feels is the deepest truth about what they are. The science of loneliness, examined in the first stage of the investigation, established that the human being is a fundamentally social being, that the need for connection is as deep as the need for food and water, and that the suffering of isolation can be as harmful to health as the major recognized risk factors for illness and early death. The work of John Cacioppo at the University of Chicago established that loneliness is a biological signal, comparable to hunger or thirst, that evolved to alert the human being to the danger of isolation and to motivate the seeking of the connection that is essential to survival and flourishing. Cacioppo's research established that loneliness is associated with measurable effects on the body and the brain, with the elevated stress hormones, the increased inflammation, and the heightened vigilance towards social threat that characterize the lonely state, effects that contribute to the harmful consequences of chronic loneliness for health and longevity. The work of Julianne Holt-Lunstad at Brigham Young University established the profound effects of social connection on health and longevity, with her meta-analyses establishing that the effects of social connection on survival are comparable to the effects of the major recognized health interventions and exceed the effects of many of the health factors that receive far more public attention. The science established, in short, that the human being is made for connection, that the longing for connection that underlies the experience of loneliness reflects the deepest truth about what the human being is, a being whose flourishing depends on connection with others. The science of loneliness does not dismiss the experience of loneliness as a mere illusion to be dispelled by clear thinking. The science establishes, on the contrary, that the experience of loneliness reflects a genuine need, the need for connection that is as fundamental to the human being as the need for food and water, and that the suffering of loneliness is the suffering of a genuine deprivation, the deprivation of the connection that the human being requires. The recognition that the experience of loneliness reflects a genuine need is the foundation of any honest engagement with the experience, since it establishes that the suffering of loneliness is not to be dismissed, but to be taken seriously, as the signal of a genuine deprivation that calls for a genuine response. The science also established that the experience of loneliness, painful as it is, can become self-perpetuating, with the heightened vigilance towards social threat that loneliness produces, leading the lonely person to perceive social interactions as more threatening than they are, and thereby to withdraw further from the connections that would alleviate the loneliness. The recognition of this mechanism bears on the practical question of how the human being may emerge from chronic loneliness, illuminating the trap through which loneliness can perpetuate itself without suggesting that the lonely person is to blame for their loneliness. The contemporary physics, examined in the second and third stages of the investigation, revealed a deep interconnectedness at the foundation of the physical world, an interconnectedness that the ordinary understanding of the world as a collection of separate things does not accommodate. The phenomenon of quantum entanglement, established through the work of Bell, Aspect, Clauser, and Zeilinger, and recognized by the Nobel Prize of 2022, established that particles that have interacted remain correlated in ways that transcend the ordinary separation of space, that the world at the deepest level is not a collection of entirely separate things, but is connected in ways that the ordinary understanding cannot accommodate. The phenomenon was first identified by Einstein, who found it impossible to accept and who described it as spooky action at a distance, and it was transformed from a matter of philosophical interpretation into an experimental question by the theorem of John Bell, whose work established that the deep interconnectedness of entangled particles could be tested by experiment. The experiments of Aspect, Clauser, and Zeilinger established, through increasingly rigorous tests, that the deep interconnectedness is a genuine feature of physical reality, a feature that the ordinary understanding of separate things cannot accommodate. The phenomenon of decoherence, established through the work of Zurek, and Juice, explained why the deeply interconnected quantum world gives rise to the apparently separate world of ordinary experience, demonstrating that the apparent separateness of the macroscopic world is an emergent consequence of the interaction of quantum systems with their environment rather than a fundamental feature of reality. The physics established, in short, that the apparent separateness of the world of ordinary experience is not the deepest truth about the physical world, that beneath the apparent separateness there is a deeper interconnectedness that the ordinary experience obscures. The physics did not establish that this deeper interconnectedness explains or eliminates the experience of loneliness, and the careful articulation of the relationship between the physical phenomenon and the human experience of connection has been a recurring theme of the investigation. The connection between entangled particles is a specific physical phenomenon, and the relationship between this phenomenon and the human experience of connection and separation is a matter for careful reflection rather than easy conflation. The decoherence of a dust particle has no evident bearing on whether the human being is, at the deepest level, connected to others, and the bridge between the physical phenomenon and the human experience of connection is speculative and should be marked clearly as such. What the physics established is the more modest but still striking recognition that the ordinary understanding of the world as a collection of entirely separate things existing independently of one another is not the deepest truth about the physical world, and that at the deepest level the world is more interconnected than the ordinary understanding assumes. The contemplative traditions, examined in the fourth and fifth stages of the investigation, developed extensive frameworks for understanding the relationship between solitude and the deepest connection, frameworks that bear striking relationship to the recognitions of the contemporary science, even as they differ substantially in their specific commitments. The traditions held, across millennia and across the most various cultures, that the apparent separateness of the self is not the deepest truth, that beneath the apparent separation there is a deeper interconnectedness or unity that the contemplative practice may reveal. The Christian tradition articulated this through the framework of communion, the recognition that the human being is created for communion with God and with others, a communion that the experience of separation obscures but does not finally destroy. The Christian tradition developed this framework through the doctrine of the Trinity, which holds that God is himself a communion of persons, and through the recognition that the human being, created in the image of this God, is created for communion, finding its deepest fulfillment in the communion with God and with others rather than in isolation. The Christian tradition developed, alongside this framework, the extensive tradition of the chosen solitude. The Desert Fathers and the hesychast monks, who withdrew into solitude for the sake of the deeper communion with God, articulating the paradox that the deepest connection may be found through the solitude in which the connection with God is deepened. The Hindu tradition articulated this through the framework of the identity between the individual self and the ultimate reality, the recognition that the apparent separateness of the self is transcended in the realization of the identity between the self and the Brahman that is its true nature. The Hindu tradition developed this framework through the great sayings of the Upanishads and the philosophical analysis of the Advaita Vedanta tradition, and it developed alongside it the extensive tradition of the renunciation, the sannyasin, who withdraws entirely from the social world to pursue the realization of the ultimate reality in complete solitude. The Buddhist tradition articulated this through the framework of the absence of any permanent separate self, the recognition that releases the contemplative from the attachment to the separate self and opens the way to the compassion for all beings. The Buddhist tradition developed this framework through the analysis of the constructed nature of the separate self and through the example of the Buddha, who attained his enlightenment in solitude, and it developed alongside it the forest tradition and the practices of the cultivation of compassion and loving kindness, through which the contemplative cultivates the connection with all beings. The Daoist tradition articulated this through the framework of the harmony with the Tao, the recognition of the alignment with the patterns of the Tao that organize all things, developed through the reflections of the Zhuangzi and the figure of the mountain recluse, who withdraws into solitude to cultivate the harmony with the Tao. The traditions developed, alongside these frameworks, extensive understandings of the chosen solitude as a path to the deepest realization or connection, the withdrawal from the distractions of the social world that the deepest pursuit requires. The traditions held that the chosen solitude, far from isolating the contemplative from others, may open the way to a deeper connection with all beings. Whether the love of the Christian tradition, the compassion of the Buddhist tradition, or the harmony with the Tao of the Daoist tradition, the convergence between the contemporary science and the contemplative traditions is striking, and it bears careful articulation. Both the contemporary science and the contemplative traditions have arrived, through their very different methods, at the recognition that the apparent separateness of ordinary experience is not the deepest truth about reality, and that beneath the apparent separateness there is a deeper interconnectedness that the ordinary experience obscures. The contemporary physics arrived at this recognition through the rigorous methods of experimental science, through the establishment of quantum entanglement and the understanding of decoherence, methods that have nothing to do with the contemplative practice and that were pursued with no intention of validating the contemplative recognition. The contemplative traditions arrived at this recognition through the contemplative practice, through the millennia of reflection on the relationship between the self and the deeper reality, a practice that has nothing to do with the experimental methods of physics, and that was pursued long before the contemporary physics existed. The convergence between these recognitions, arrived at through such different methods and in such different contexts, is genuinely striking, and it bears consideration in any honest engagement with the question of separateness and connection that lies at the heart of the experience of loneliness. The ancient contemplatives who articulated the recognition that the apparent separateness of the self is not the deepest truth had no access to the contemporary physics, and the contemporary physicists who established the deep interconnectedness of the quantum world had no intention of validating the contemplative recognition, and yet the recognitions converge, through their very different methods, on the recognition that the apparent separateness of ordinary experience is not the deepest truth about reality. The convergence does not establish that the physics proves the contemplative recognition, or that the contemplative recognition is validated by the physics. The physical understanding of the deep interconnectedness of the quantum world and the contemplative recognition of the deeper interconnectedness of the self are claims of different kinds, established through different methods, and the relationship between them is a matter for careful reflection rather than easy conflation. Any bridge between the physical phenomenon and the contemplative recognition is speculative and should be marked clearly as such. What the convergence establishes is the more modest but still striking recognition that both the contemporary science and the contemplative traditions, through their very different methods, have arrived at the recognition that the apparent separateness of ordinary experience is not the deepest truth about reality. The genuine differences between the contemplative traditions deserve to be articulated honestly rather than dissolved into a vague framework that would treat them as merely different formulations of a single underlying truth. The traditions differ profoundly in their understanding of what the deeper reality beneath the apparent separateness is. The Christian tradition holds that the deeper reality is the communion with the personal God, a communion of love between the human being and the God who is himself a communion of persons, a communion in which the individual person is not dissolved but is fulfilled in the relationship of love. The Hindu tradition holds, on the Advaitic interpretation, that the deeper reality is the single ultimate reality of Brahman, with which the individual self is ultimately identical, the apparent separateness of the individual self being ultimately dissolved in the recognition of the single reality that all things are. The difference between these two frameworks is profound, since the Christian framework preserves the distinction between the human being and God, even in the deepest communion, a communion of love between distinct persons, while the Advaitic framework dissolves the apparent distinction between the individual self and the ultimate reality in the recognition of their ultimate identity. The Buddhist tradition holds that there is no permanent self at all, that the deepest realization is the recognition of the absence of any permanent separate self, a recognition that differs profoundly from the Hindu affirmation of the eternal self that is identical with the ultimate reality. The Daoist tradition holds that the deeper reality is the Tao, the ineffable source and pattern of all things, with which the sage attains harmony through the cultivation of stillness and spontaneity, a framework that differs again from the others in its understanding of the deeper reality and of the relationship between the self and it. These are genuinely different understandings of what the deeper reality is, and the differences between them cannot be dissolved by treating them as merely different ways of saying the same thing. The disagreement between the Hindu affirmation of the eternal self and the Buddhist denial of any permanent self is, in particular, one of the most significant philosophical disagreements in the history of human thought, a disagreement that the two traditions have articulated and defended through extensive philosophical analysis across more than 2 millennia, and it cannot be dissolved by treating the two frameworks as merely different formulations of a single truth. The honest engagement with the traditions requires acknowledging these differences rather than dissolving them into a vague common essence that none of the traditions would actually endorse. The perennialist framework that treats all the traditions as saying essentially the same thing fails to engage what the traditions themselves articulate, and it obscures the genuine philosophical and theological work that the traditions have done in developing and defending their distinctive frameworks. The convergence between the traditions is not an agreement on the nature of the deeper reality on which they differ profoundly, but a convergence on the recognition that the apparent separateness of the self is not the deepest truth, a recognition that the traditions articulate through their genuinely different and in important respects incompatible frameworks. The popular discussions of these matters have often gone substantially beyond what the available evidence supports, conflating the legitimate science with broader claims that the science does not establish, and conflating the genuine insights of the traditions with a vague common essence that obscures their genuine differences. The popular framework that holds that quantum entanglement establishes a literal connection between human beings, or that the physics establishes that we are all one in a manner that validates specific spiritual claims, draws specific implications from the physics that the physics itself does not support. The popular framework that holds that the loneliness a person feels is somehow not real, that the separateness is a mere illusion to be dispelled by the recognition of the quantum interconnectedness, both misrepresents the physics and dismisses the genuine reality of the suffering that loneliness causes. The legitimate physics establishes the deep interconnectedness of the quantum world and the emergent nature of macroscopic separateness, while not establishing that the human being is connected to others through quantum processes in any manner that would explain or eliminate the experience of loneliness. The careful position is to engage with what the legitimate science actually establishes, while engaging the experience of loneliness and the broader questions about connection through whatever philosophical and contemplative resources may be relevant, maintaining the distinction between the legitimate science, the legitimate contemplative frameworks, and the popular frameworks that conflate the two in ways that neither the science nor the traditions would actually endorse. The various popular frameworks have been criticized by serious physicists and philosophers, including Sean Carroll at Johns Hopkins University, who has written extensively on the proper interpretation of quantum mechanics and on the ways in which the popular treatments distort what the physics actually establishes. The maintenance of this distinction is essential to the honest engagement with these questions, since the conflation of the categories has been a persistent source of confusion that has obscured both what the science actually establishes and what the traditions actually articulate. The experience of loneliness is real, and the suffering that it causes is real, and no honest engagement with the experience can begin by dismissing it as a mere illusion. The recognition of the deeper interconnectedness that both the physics and the contemplative traditions have been uncovering does not dismiss the experience of loneliness, but offers, perhaps, a different perspective on what the experience ultimately means. The distinction between dismissing the experience of loneliness and offering a different perspective on it bears emphasis. Since the popular frameworks often slide from the legitimate recognition of the deeper interconnectedness into the illegitimate dismissal of the experience of loneliness, suggesting that the lonely person should simply recognize that they are not really alone and thereby cease to suffer. The honest engagement with the experience of loneliness does not dismiss the suffering but takes it seriously, while offering, where it may be relevant, the recognition that the separateness the lonely person feels may not be the deepest truth about what they are. What does this synthesis mean for you, the person who feels alone? The investigation cannot answer this question for you, and it would be both false and presumptuous to claim that the recognition of the deeper interconnectedness somehow dissolves the experience of loneliness or eliminates the suffering that it causes. The feeling of loneliness is real, and the need for connection that underlies it is real, and the recognition of the deeper interconnectedness does not eliminate the need for the human connection that the science of loneliness has established to be as fundamental as the need for food and water. If you feel alone, the recognition of the deeper interconnectedness is not a substitute for the human connection that you need, and the honest response to loneliness includes the seeking of that connection, the reaching out to others, the building of the relationships that meet the fundamental human need. It would be a misuse of the recognitions that this investigation has examined to treat them as a reason to accept loneliness, rather than to seek the connection that the human being requires, or to suggest that the recognition of the deeper interconnectedness somehow makes the human connection unnecessary. The science of loneliness has established that the human being needs connection, that the suffering of loneliness is the signal of a genuine deprivation, and that the honest response to loneliness includes the seeking of the connection that the human being needs. The seeking of connection may take many forms: the reaching out to others, the building of relationships, the participation in the communities that meet the human need for connection. And the science of loneliness suggests that this seeking, difficult as it may be for the person caught in the self-perpetuating trap of chronic loneliness, is the genuine response to the genuine need that the loneliness signals. The recognition of the deeper interconnectedness does not replace this seeking, but may, perhaps, accompany it, offering a different perspective on the separateness that the loneliness involves, even as the seeking of connection addresses the genuine need that the loneliness signals. What the recognition of the deeper interconnectedness offers is not a substitute for human connection, but a different perspective on the separateness that the loneliness involves. The recognition that the separateness you feel, real and painful as it is, may not be the deepest truth about what you are. The contemporary physics has established that the apparent separateness of the world is not the deepest truth about the physical world, that beneath the apparent separateness there is a deeper interconnectedness. The contemplative traditions have held, across millennia, that the apparent separateness of the self is not the deepest truth about the self, that beneath the apparent separation there is a deeper interconnectedness or unity that the contemplative practice may reveal. Whether these recognitions bear on the experience of loneliness, whether the recognition that the separateness is not the deepest truth might offer some consolation or some reorientation in the experience of loneliness, is a question that only you can answer through whatever resources may be relevant to your own engagement with the experience. The investigation does not claim that the recognition of the deeper interconnectedness eliminates the loneliness. The investigation suggests, more modestly, that the separateness the lonely person feels, real and painful as it is, exists alongside a deeper interconnectedness that both the physics and the contemplative traditions have been uncovering, and that the recognition of this deeper interconnectedness may offer a different perspective on what the experience of separateness ultimately means. The perspective does not eliminate the suffering, but it may perhaps place the suffering within a larger context, the context of a reality that is, at the deepest level, more interconnected than the experience of separateness suggests. The contemplative traditions offer, beyond this recognition, the further suggestion that the experience of aloneness may, through certain practices and orientations, be transformed from the suffering of loneliness into the chosen solitude that opens the way to the deepest connection. The traditions distinguished, across millennia of reflection, between the suffering of loneliness and the chosen solitude of the contemplative, between the painful experience of the absence of connection and the deliberate withdrawal that opens the way to the deepest connection. The traditions held that the human being may, through the contemplative pursuit, transform the experience of aloneness from the suffering of loneliness into the solitude that opens the way to the deepest connection. Whether the communion with God of the Christian tradition, the realization of the ultimate reality of the Hindu tradition, the compassion for all beings of the Buddhist tradition, or the harmony with the Tao of the Daoist tradition, the transformation that the traditions describe is not a denial of the human need for connection, but a discovery that the deepest connection may be found in a place that the lonely person had experienced as the very absence of connection, in the solitude that the lonely person had experienced as the source of their suffering. The traditions held that the aloneness that the lonely person experiences as a deprivation may, through the contemplative pursuit, be transformed into the solitude that opens the way to the deepest connection, a connection with the deeper reality that the contemplative pursuit seeks, and, through that deeper reality, with all beings. The traditions did not suggest that this transformation is easy, or that the suffering of loneliness can simply be willed away, or that the person who suffers from loneliness is somehow failing to undertake the transformation that the traditions describe. The transformation that the traditions describe is the fruit of a long and demanding contemplative pursuit, not a simple reframing that can be accomplished by an act of will, and the traditions did not suggest that the lonely person should simply cease to seek the human connection that they need and turn instead to the contemplative pursuit. The traditions suggested, more modestly, that the accumulated wisdom of the contemplative traditions, developed across millennia of reflection on the relationship between solitude and the deepest connection, may offer resources for understanding the experience of aloneness and for finding, where possible, within the experience of aloneness, the possibility of a connection deeper than the one whose absence the loneliness signals. The transformation that the traditions describe is not the elimination of the need for connection, but the discovery of a connection deeper than the one whose absence the loneliness had signaled. A connection with the deeper reality that the traditions have variously named, a connection that the chosen solitude of the contemplative pursuit opens. Whether this transformation is available to you, and whether the resources of the contemplative traditions might bear on your own experience of aloneness, is a question that only you can answer through whatever resources may be relevant to your own engagement with the experience. The question of whether we are, at the deepest level, alone is, considered carefully, the question that this investigation has been pursuing through all its stages. The experience of loneliness is the experience of separateness, the sense of being one separate self among others, cut off by the boundary of the individual being from the connection that the human being longs for. The investigation has examined whether this experience of separateness is the deepest truth about what we are, or whether beneath the apparent separateness there is a deeper interconnectedness that both the physics and the contemplative traditions have been uncovering. The contemporary physics has established that the apparent separateness of the world is not the deepest truth about the physical world. The contemplative traditions have held that the apparent separateness of the self is not the deepest truth about the self. The convergence between these recognitions, arrived at through such different methods, is genuinely striking, even as the relationship between them requires careful examination, and even as the traditions differ profoundly in their understanding of what the deeper reality is. The convergence does not establish that we are not, in any sense, alone, or that the experience of loneliness is somehow mistaken. The convergence establishes the more modest but still striking recognition that the apparent separateness of ordinary experience is not the deepest truth about reality, and that the question of whether we are, at the deepest level, alone is more complex and more interesting than the ordinary understanding assumes. The ordinary understanding holds that we are separate selves, each enclosed within the boundary of the individual being, fundamentally separate from one another, and that the experience of separateness is simply the truth about what we are. The investigation has suggested that this ordinary understanding may not be the deepest truth, that beneath the apparent separateness there is a deeper interconnectedness that both the physics and the contemplative traditions have been uncovering. Whether this deeper interconnectedness bears on the experience of loneliness, whether the recognition that the separateness is not the deepest truth might offer some consolation or some reorientation in the experience of loneliness, is a question that the investigation cannot answer for you, a question that you must address through whatever resources may be relevant to your own engagement with the experience. You feel alone. The feeling is real, and the need for connection that underlies it is real, and the suffering that it causes is real. Nothing in this investigation dismisses the reality of what you feel, and nothing in it offers a substitute for the human connection that you need, the reaching out to others that the honest response to loneliness includes. And yet the separateness that you feel, real and painful as it is, exists alongside a deeper interconnectedness that both the contemporary physics and the contemplative traditions have been uncovering. The deep interconnectedness of the quantum world that the ordinary experience obscures, and the deeper interconnectedness of the self that the contemplative traditions have held, the contemplative practice may reveal. The world that presents itself as a collection of separate things is, at the deepest level, more interconnected than the ordinary understanding assumes. The self that experiences itself as fundamentally separate is, the contemplative traditions have held across millennia, not as separate as it appears. These recognitions do not eliminate the loneliness, and they are not a substitute for the human connection that you need, but they place the experience of separateness within a larger context, the context of a reality that is, at the deepest level, more interconnected than the experience of separateness suggests. A context in which the question of whether you are, at the deepest level, alone is more complex and more interesting than the ordinary understanding assumes. What you make of these recognitions, whether they offer some consolation or some reorientation in the experience of loneliness, is yours alone to develop, through whatever resources may be relevant to your own engagement with the experience. The investigation has offered the resources. The development is yours. You feel alone, and the feeling is real. And yet you are reading these words, which someone else has written, across whatever distance separates the writing from the reading. so that even in the experience of loneliness you are connected to the countless others who have felt what you feel, and to the one who wrote these words in the hope that they might reach you. The separateness is real. The connection is real. Which is the deepest truth about what you are, is the question that the investigation has examined, and that you will continue to examine, across whatever life you have been given to live. The making is yours. The making is yours alone. And you are not perhaps as alone as you feel.